The last precise stroke of the cartographer's pen, a delicate sable brush barely thicker than a sigh, completed the intricate rendering of a submerged reef system, its dangerous beauty now faithfully recorded on the vast expanse of vellum that covered nearly the entirety of Master Jonah Alistair Finch's grand oak drafting table. He straightened his 60-year-old frame, a movement accompanied by a soft groan that was more habit than true complaint, and meticulously cleaned the nib in the small pot of distilled water, his movements honed by a lifetime of such exacting, patient work. The scent of India ink, beeswax from the candles that augmented the failing afternoon light, and old parchment filled the circular upper room of his tower study, a room that felt more like a sanctuary than a workshop. From its deeply embrasured windows one could see the vast, slate-gray sweep of the northern ocean, its horizon a blurred line where the sea met a sky already beginning to blush with the first subtle hues of approaching sunset. For 40 years, Jonah had lived and worked in this solitary tower, the Sea Watch, as it was locally known, perched on a rugged headland, his life dedicated to the ancient, sacred art of mapping the known and the hinted at, the seen, and the supposed. His charts were renowned for their accuracy, their artistry, and a certain almost mystical quality that seemed to capture not just the geography, but the very spirit of the places they depicted. Tonight, however, as he covered the nearly completed chart of the treacherous shoals with a soft linen cloth, a familiar, quiet restlessness began to stir within him, a feeling as subtle and pervasive as the scent of salt that always permeated the air here, a sense that sleep, when it eventually came, might first require a different kind of charting, a navigation of his own inner waters. He moved to the western window, his footsteps barely making a sound on the age-smoothed wooden floorboards. The sun, a fiery disk, was now kissing the turbulent edge of the ocean, sending a brilliant molten gold path across the waves, a path that seemed to lead directly to the feet of his tower. It was a sight he had witnessed countless times, yet its majesty never failed to stir something profound within him. He thought of the ancient mariners, navigating by such celestial events, by the steady, faithful patterns of stars and sun, their lives dependent on their ability to read these divine signs, to trust in a guidance that transcended their own limited understanding. His own work felt like a continuation of that ancient trust, a partnership with the navigators of old, and ultimately with the great navigator who had first charted the courses of the stars and set the boundaries of the seas. But lately, as this magnum opus of the treacherous shoals neared its completion, a project that had consumed the better part of the last decade, a new, unmapped territory seemed to be opening up within his own soul. The lands of what next, of purpose fulfilled, yet life remaining. These were less tangible, more mist-shrouded regions than any he had ever committed to parchment, and they brought with them a quiet disquiet, a need for a different kind of compass, a different kind of light. Have you ever stood at such a juncture, dear listener, where a long-held purpose nears its end, and the horizon beyond seems both vast and veiled, full of possibility yet tinged with an unfamiliar uncertainty? It is in these transitional seasons, isn't it, that the soul's deepest need for anchorage, for a peace that is not dependent on the familiar, makes itself most keenly felt. Jonah turned from the window as the last sliver of the sun disappeared, plunging the room into a deeper twilight, relieved only by the soft, steady glow of the beeswax candles on his desk and the distant, rhythmic pulse of the Porthcarrick lighthouse, miles down the coast, whose friendly beam would soon begin its nightly sweep. He lit a few more candles, their small flames pushing back the encroaching shadows, creating a warm, intimate circle of light in the vastness of the approaching night. He wasn't afraid of the dark. Indeed, some of his most profound insights, his most creative cartographic solutions, had come to him in the deep stillness of the night, when the distractions of the day were silenced, and the whispers of intuition, or perhaps of something greater, could be more clearly heard. But tonight, The darkness seemed to mirror the unilluminated corners of his own thoughts about the future. His life had been so clearly defined by his work, by the meticulous creation of charts that brought order and understanding to the often chaotic and dangerous interface between land and sea. What would define it now, when this last great chart was done? He was not a young man. The thought of embarking on another project of similar magnitude felt overwhelming, perhaps even beyond his remaining strength. Yet the thought of true idleness, of a life without the deep satisfaction of his craft, felt like a barren, uncharted desert. Lord of tides and constellations, you who set the stars in their appointed paths, Jonah breathed. The words, a familiar invocation, a well-worn pathway into the presence of the one he had always considered the ultimate cartographer. Guide now the currents of my own heart, for the familiar landmarks seem to be receding, and the way ahead is not yet clear. His prayer was not a demand for instant answers, for a detailed map of his remaining years. It was more a statement of his disorientation, a humble admission of his need for guidance, for a reassurance that even in this new, unplotted season, he was not adrift, not alone. He remembered the story of Abraham, called to leave his country and his kindred, to go to a land that God would show him. Abraham had set out, Scripture said, not knowing where he was going. That phrase had always struck Jonah with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Such faith, such trust in a guidance so completely unseen, so reliant on a voice heard only in the soul. Could he, Jonah Alistair Finch, a man of precision, of visible lines and calculated measurements, find such faith for his own less dramatic, yet equally significant, internal journey? He took down from a high shelf a particularly ancient and treasured volume, not a book of charts, but a very old, leather-bound copy of the Psalms, its pages brittle and foxed, its Latin script faded but still legible. He didn't open it immediately, but simply held it in his hands, feeling the weight of its age, the accumulated wisdom and devotion of centuries contained within its covers. He often found that the Psalms, more than any other part of Scripture, spoke to the nuanced landscapes of the human heart, its joys, its sorrows, its doubts, its yearnings, its exultant praises, and its cries for help from the depths. They were, in a way, the most honest and comprehensive charts of the soul's journey ever committed to writing. And tonight, he felt a particular need for their ancient, steadying wisdom. He knew that the peace required for truly restorative sleep often began with this kind of quiet turning, this conscious seeking of a perspective larger than his own immediate concerns. His mind wandered to the journeys of St. Paul, a man who had traversed vast expanses of the Roman world, often by sea, facing shipwrecks, storms, and myriad dangers, yet always driven by an unwavering sense of divine commission, his inner compass fixed on a purpose that transcended his own comfort or safety. Jonah, from the relative safety of his tower, had often marveled at such courage, such relentless dedication. His own voyages had been largely intellectual, spiritual, artistic, plotting courses through ancient texts, navigating the complex mathematics of projection, exploring the aesthetic challenges of rendering a three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional surface. Yet he felt a kinship with Paul's sense of being sent, of having a work to do that was not entirely of his own choosing, but a response to a higher calling. And if Paul could find peace and even joy amidst such external turmoil, trusting in the God who had called him, then surely he, Jonah, could find peace in the quieter, more internal storm of his own life's transition. He thought of the concept of wayfinding used by the ancient Polynesian navigators, who had crossed vast, featureless expanses of the Pacific Ocean using only their profound knowledge of star paths, wave patterns, bird migrations, and the subtle signs of distant land present in the very color and temperature of the water. It was an art that required an almost mystical attunement to the natural world, a deep, intuitive understanding that went far beyond what could be written on any chart. Perhaps, Jonah mused, navigating the later seasons of life required a similar kind of spiritual wayfinding, a letting go of the need for precise, detailed maps, and a deeper reliance on the subtle internal cues of the Holy Spirit, on the accumulated wisdom of a life lived in faith, on the distant but steady light of God's eternal promises. This meant embracing a degree of uncertainty, of not knowing, which was counterintuitive for a man whose entire profession was dedicated to producing certainty, to making the unknown known. Yet, there was also a strange liberation in the thought, a release from the burden of having to chart every step himself. The room was growing cooler as the last of the day's warmth radiated out through the thick stone walls. Jonah moved to his small hearth, where a fire was already laid, and put a taper to the kindling. The dry wood caught quickly, the flames, leaping up with a cheerful crackle, sending a welcome warmth and a flickering, dancing light into the room. He drew up his old, comfortable armchair, its leather worn soft and shiny with age, and finally opened the book of Psalms, letting its pages fall open where they would. His eyes, accustomed to deciphering the faintest lines on ancient charts, easily found their place in the dim, wavering candlelight. He read, not with a scholar's critical eye, but with a seeker's open heart. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. The words, so familiar, yet tonight they resonated with a fresh, poignant clarity. Lean not on your own understanding. For a cartographer, a man whose life was built on understanding, on measuring, on meticulously defining, this was a profound challenge and a profound invitation. It was an invitation to a different kind of knowledge, a knowledge born of faith, of surrender, of trusting in a wisdom infinitely greater than his own. He closed his eyes for a moment, the heavy book resting in his lap, and pictured himself as a small ship on a vast, starlit sea. The charts he had so painstakingly drawn, which had guided him through so much of his life's voyage, now seemed to cover only a small, familiar portion of that immense ocean. Ahead, the waters were largely unmapped, the constellations, perhaps, unfamiliar. Yet he was not alone. There was a pilot, unseen but ever-present, whose knowledge of these waters was absolute, whose hand on the tiller was infinitely skilled, infinitely gentle, and the invitation was simply to trust that pilot, to allow his small vessel to be guided, not by his own anxious calculations, but by that unerring, loving hand. This image brought a quiet sense of release, a gentle loosening of the knot of uncertainty that had been tightening within him. Sleep, he knew, would come more easily from this place of yielded trust. He considered the stars, those celestial mariners' guides. For millennia they had wheeled in their appointed courses, their patterns an unchanging testament to divine order, to a faithfulness that spanned epochs. Sailors had looked to Polaris, the North Star, for centuries, a fixed point in a turning world, a reliable indicator of true north. Was not God himself such a fixed point, such an ultimate reference in the often confusing voyage of human existence? Circumstances changed, seasons turned. His own life was entering a new, less defined phase. But God remained constant, his love unwavering, his wisdom eternal. Anchoring his soul to that unchanging reality was the key, Jonah felt, to navigating any uncharted waters, whether external or internal, with peace and with hope. The task now was to allow that truth to seep from his intellect into the very core of his being, to become not just a theological concept, but a lived, experiential reality that could dispel the mists of his own small fears and uncertainties. The fire in the hearth settled into a steady, comforting glow, its warmth seeping into his bones. The rhythmic pulse of the Porthcarrick lighthouse beam, briefly illuminating a section of his study window with each sweep, was like a distant, reassuring heartbeat. The restlessness within him was beginning to subside, replaced by a growing sense of calm, a quiet anticipation of the peace that God so often granted in the surrendered stillness of the night. He had brought his unmapped territories, his unspoken questions into the presence of the great cartographer of souls. He had acknowledged his need for guidance, and now he could begin to lay aside his own efforts to chart the way ahead, and simply trust in the one who had promised to direct his paths. The journey into the tranquil haven of sleep, he sensed, was about to begin. A journey guided not by compass and chart, but by the gentle, irresistible current of divine grace. Perhaps, dear listener, as Jonah sits in the quiet solitude of his sea watchtower, you too are facing your own unmapped territories, your own transitions, your own quiet questions about the way ahead. Do you hear the gentle invitation to trust in a guidance that transcends your own understanding, to lean into a wisdom far greater than your own? As the night deepens and the world outside grows still, allow the spirit of this story, the quiet faith of this old mapmaker, to draw you towards your own place of inner peace. Release the charts of your own making, and surrender to the loving, unerring guidance of the divine navigator. He knows the way, even when the path is veiled in mist. Let us journey with Jonah as he prepares to set sail on the peaceful waters of restorative sleep, trusting in the eternal stars of God's faithfulness to light his way. Jonah Alistair Finch, master cartographer, scholar of coastlines and keeper of the Sea Watch Tower, slowly closed the ancient, heavy psalter, its familiar weight a comforting presence in his lap. The fire in the hearth had settled into a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, warm, and deeply peaceful light throughout the circular study, causing the shadows of his tall bookcases and numerous rolled charts to lengthen and dance with a gentle, almost somnolent grace on the curved stone walls. The rhythmic pulse of the Porthcarrick lighthouse, visible as a fleeting friendly flash through the western window with each majestic sweep, was a steadfast, reassuring metronome in the profound quiet of the descending night. The earlier, subtle disquiet that had touched his spirit concerning the completion of his life's great work and the unmapped territory of his future had not been entirely banished, for such fundamental life questions rarely dissolve with a single prayer or insight, but it had significantly softened, its sharp edges smoothed by the wisdom of the Psalms and his own conscious act of commending his path to a higher, more loving guidance. A sense of peaceful anticipation was beginning to well within him, an anticipation not of answers, but of rest, of the deep, restorative communion that sleep so often brought in this solitary, sacred space. He rose from his deeply cushioned armchair, the leather sighing softly as it released his weight, and moved with the deliberate, unhurried grace of a man accustomed to navigating his familiar surroundings, even in near darkness. His first action was to meticulously tend to his precious drafting tools. He wiped down the long, polished ruling pens, cleaned the ivory-handled dividers and compasses, and carefully stored the small pots of finely ground pigments he used for illuminating his charts. The lapis lazuli for the deep oceans, the verdigris for the shallow coastal waters, the ochre for the land masses. Each tool was a familiar friend, an extension of his own hand and mind, and he cared for them with a respect that bordered on reverence. This nightly ritual was not just about preserving the instruments of his craft. It was a way of formally concluding the day's labors, of drawing a clear line between the meticulous demands of his art and the approaching surrender of sleep. It was an act of closure, a preparation for letting go. His study, perched at the very top of the stone tower, was a circular room, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with shelves groaning under the weight of ancient atlases, nautical almanacs, explorers' journals, and his own meticulously kept records of tidal patterns, current drifts, and newly discovered geographical features reported by mariners from distant ports. Rolled charts, some of ancient parchment, others of more modern vellum, stood like silent sentinels in tall wicker baskets, or lay secured with leather thongs in specially constructed wooden cradles. A large celestial globe, its constellations picked out in faded gold leaf, occupied one corner. A terrestrial globe of similar vintage, its companion in another. It was a room that smelled of age, of knowledge, of the sea, and tonight, increasingly, of the profound peace that was settling over its solitary inhabitant. Jonah moved through this repository of human striving to understand and navigate the world, and he felt not the weight of its accumulated knowledge, but a sense of continuity, of being a small, humble link in a long chain of seekers, of explorers, both of the external world and the internal. He thought of the earliest mapmakers, men who had pieced together their charts from sailors' often contradictory tales, from fragmented accounts of distant lands, from their own courageous, often perilous, voyages into the unknown. Their maps were often works of art as much as science, filled with fantastical creatures in the unexplored regions, with warnings of "Here be dragons" in the vast, empty spaces of the oceans. Yet, within their inaccuracies, there was a profound human yearning to understand, to connect, to find one's way. And underlying it all, Jonah believed, was an intuitive sense of a larger order, a divine blueprint that their small efforts were attempting to discern and record. His own work, benefiting from centuries of accumulated knowledge and more precise instruments, was perhaps more accurate, but he felt that the heart of the cartographer remained the same, a desire to bring light to what was dark, order to what was chaotic, and to provide a reliable guide for those who journeyed. And tonight, as he prepared for his own inward journey into the unmapped territory of sleep, he felt a deep need for that ultimate divine guide. He remembered the story of the Magi, the wise men from the East, who had followed a star, an unexpected, celestial guide on a long and arduous journey to find the infant Jesus. They were scholars, astronomers, men of knowledge, yet they had been willing to leave the familiar, to trust in a sign that transcended their existing charts and calculations. Their journey was one of profound faith, a willingness to be led by a light they did not fully understand, to a destination whose ultimate significance they could only begin to glimpse. Jonah often felt that the journey of faith, especially in times of transition or uncertainty, was much like that of the Magi. It required a letting go of one's own well-plotted maps, a willingness to look for and to follow the unexpected stars of divine guidance that might appear in the most unlooked-for places. A passage of Scripture read with new eyes, a word of wisdom from an unexpected source, a deep, intuitive prompting in the quiet of one's own heart, or the profound peace that settled after a night of deep, prayerful rest. His small sleeping chamber was reached by a short, steep spiral staircase leading down from the main study. It was a simpler room, smaller, its single window narrower and facing east, designed to catch the very first rays of the morning sun. The walls here were of bare, dressed stone, cool to the touch, and the only furnishings were a narrow bed built into an alcove, a small chest for his clothes, and a single sturdy wooden chair. There were no charts here, no books, no instruments of his trade. This was a space dedicated solely to rest, to a complete detachment from the intellectual and artistic labors of his waking hours. As he descended the stairs, each step felt like a further letting go, a deeper movement away from the demands of his conscious mind and towards the receptive stillness required for true, restorative sleep. The air in the sleeping chamber was cooler than in the study above, carrying a clean, almost bracing scent of the sea, a scent he had breathed almost every night of his adult life and found profoundly conducive to peace. He paused at the small, deeply embrasured window, looking out into the profound, star-dusted darkness. The Porthcarrick lighthouse beam was no longer visible from this angle, but he knew it was there, faithfully turning, a silent, luminous comrade in the night. The only sounds were the distant, rhythmic sigh of the surf at the base of the headland, a sound so constant it was almost a form of silence, and the soft, almost inaudible whisper of the wind as it eddied around the ancient stones of the tower. He felt a profound sense of solitude, but it was not loneliness. It was the chosen solitude of a man who had found his deepest companionship in the presence of God, in the vast, eloquent silence of creation. In this solitude, he could hear the often faint whispers of his own soul, and the even fainter, more profound whispers of the divine. He thought of the prophet Elijah, after his great victory on Mount Carmel, fleeing into the wilderness, exhausted and despairing, asking God to take his life, and how God had met him there, not with rebuke, but with tender care, sending an angel to feed him, allowing him to sleep, and then speaking to him not in the wind, nor the earthquake, nor the fire, but in a still small voice, or as some translations put it, a sound of gentle stillness. Jonah had often found that his own most profound encounters with God, his clearest sense of guidance, his deepest experiences of peace, had come not in moments of dramatic revelation or intense spiritual effort, but in times of quiet, yielded stillness, often in the liminal space just before sleep, or in the fresh clarity of early morning after a night of deep rest. It was in the gentle stillness that the divine voice was most clearly heard, the divine presence most keenly felt, and he was now consciously preparing himself to enter that stillness. He performed his simple ablutions, the cool water refreshing on his face and hands. He changed into his plain linen nightshirt, its familiar softness a comforting sensation against his skin. Each mundane action was performed with a quiet deliberateness, a mindful presence that was itself a form of prayer, a way of honoring the temple of his body and preparing it for its nightly Sabbath. He was not rushing towards oblivion, but gently, reverently approaching a sacred space, a time of holy inactivity, where the deepest work of renewal would be accomplished by a power beyond his own. His bed was firm, covered with a thick hand-stitched quilt that had been his mother's, its patterns faded but its warmth enduring. As he lay down, the coolness of the linen sheets was a welcome sensation. He pulled the quilt up to his chin, its familiar weight a comforting pressure, a tangible reminder of love and continuity. He closed his eyes, and the sounds of the night, the distant surf, the whispering wind, seemed to draw closer, to become a soft, enveloping cocoon of sound, a natural lullaby that excluded all other, more jarring noises. His breathing, already slow and regular, began to deepen further, each exhalation a conscious release of any lingering tension, any residual thought, any final concern about the unmapped territories of his life. He was simply letting go, trusting, yielding, a profound sense of being cradled, of being held securely in an infinitely vast, infinitely tender, and infinitely wise embrace, began to permeate his entire being. It was the feeling a small, weary child has when it finally nestles into its parent's arms, all struggles ceased, all fears banished, all needs implicitly understood and lovingly met. Jonah, the master mapmaker, the scholar of precise lines and calculated distances, now released all his own charts, all his own understandings, and surrendered himself to the unchartable, immeasurable, yet utterly reliable love of God. This was the true north of his soul, the fixed point around which his entire being could rest in perfect peace. The journey into the deep, restorative waters of sleep was well underway, guided not by any earthly map, but by the unerring, loving compass of divine grace. The gentle, inexorable current of sleep, having detached Jonah from the familiar coastline of his waking thoughts and conscious perceptions, now drew him steadily into the deep, mysterious, and profoundly tranquil ocean of true slumber. The last faint echoes of the sea-watch tower, the distant sigh of the surf, the soft whisper of the night wind around its ancient stones, dissolved into an encompassing silence. A silence that was not empty or void, but pregnant with a sacred, restorative presence. His breathing, now as slow, even, and almost imperceptible as the tectonic shift of continents, was the sole outward indicator of the life gently held within his resting form. In this hidden, holy realm, Jonah the cartographer, the meticulous delineator of the known world, became himself an unmapped territory, willingly surrendered to the exploration and renewal of the divine geographer, the one who had first dreamed the coastlines of creation and set the stars in their appointed courses. The soft, residual glow of the embers in his study far above, and the rhythmic, distant flash of the Porthcarrick lighthouse were now utterly beyond his ken. Yet his spirit, untethered and serene, was bathed in an inner light, a peaceful luminescence that originated from a source far more ancient and enduring than any physical flame or man-made beacon. In this state of profound unconsciousness, where the ceaseless loom of the analytical mind is stilled and the carefully constructed defenses of the ego are laid down, the soul becomes exceptionally vulnerable and uniquely receptive to the deepest ministries of grace. For Jonah, these hours were not a mere hiatus from existence, a blank interlude between yesterday and tomorrow, but a period of intense, though entirely passive, spiritual saturation. It was as if his entire being, spirit, soul, and body, had become a porous vessel, immersed in the boundless ocean of God's love, a love that cleansed, healed, and renewed at levels far beyond the reach of his conscious will or understanding. The unspoken anxieties about his future, the subtle weariness from decades of exacting work, the faint, residual griefs that life inevitably bestows, all were being gently addressed, not by effort or analysis, but by the silent, potent alchemy of divine peace, a peace that dissolved dissonance and restored an intrinsic, God-given harmony to the deepest strata of his being. This was not an escape from reality, but an immersion in a deeper, more fundamental reality, the reality of God's unwavering restorative presence. If his dormant mind entertained any flicker of imagery, it was far removed from the sharp, defined lines of his cartographic endeavors or the logical progressions of waking thought. Instead, it might be the pure sensation of boundless expansion, a feeling of his individual consciousness dissolving into an infinite expanse of warm, compassionate light, where all boundaries, all limitations, all sense of isolated selfhood vanished, leaving only a profound, joyful sense of unity with the all. Or perhaps he experienced a timeless journey through celestial landscapes of unimaginable beauty and serenity, not as an observer, but as an integral part of that divine tableau, every element resonating with a silent, perfect harmony that was the very essence of God's peace. These were not mere dreams to be recalled and deciphered, but rather profound experiential encounters with the numinous, subtle spiritual attunements that were recalibrating his soul, aligning it more perfectly with the eternal verities, steeping him in a love that was beyond definition, a peace that was beyond comprehension. He often thought in his waking hours of the biblical account of the creation, where, after each day's divine labor, it is written, "And God saw that it was good. And then, on the seventh day, God rested from all his work, and he blessed the seventh day and made it holy." Jonah had come to understand that this divine rest was not a sign of weariness, but a celebration of completion, a dwelling in the perfection of what had been made, and he felt that human sleep, especially when it was deep and peaceful and surrendered to God, was a small participation in that sacred seventh-day rest. It was a time to cease from one's own making, one's own striving, and to simply be, in the goodness of God's creation, to allow oneself to be remade, recalibrated, realigned with that original divine intention. His own meticulous work of charting the physical world, in a way, was an attempt to reflect that divine order, that goodness, and his nightly rest was a humble acknowledgement that the ultimate order, the ultimate goodness, the ultimate source of all true peace, resided not in his charts, but in the chartmaker himself. The very stones of the Sea-Watch Tower, which had absorbed the sun's warmth during the day and now radiated a faint, residual coolness in the deep of night, seemed to participate in this profound stillness. The tower had stood for generations, a silent witness to countless storms and myriad calms, a steadfast landmark for those at sea. And Jonah, within its protective embrace, felt a deep kinship with its endurance, its resilience. He, too, was called to be a steadfast beacon, in his own way, and he knew that the strength for such steadfastness, the clarity for such a light, was forged not in the crucible of anxious effort, but in the quiet sanctuary of yielded rest, where the soul is reconnected to its eternal source. The peace he was experiencing was not a fragile, ephemeral mood. It was the deep, quiet power of a spirit securely anchored in the unchanging reality of God's love. He remembered the story of Jesus telling his disciples, "Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which neither have storehouse nor barn, and God feedeth them. How much more are ye better than the fowls? Or the lilies, how they grow, they toil not, they spin not. Yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these." These passages for Jonah were not injunctions to idleness or irresponsibility, but profound invitations to a deeper kind of trust, a letting go of anxious self-provision, a confident reliance on the encompassing care of the Heavenly Father. His own life's work required immense diligence, meticulous planning, unwavering attention to detail. Yet he knew that underlying all his efforts, sustaining all his abilities, was that divine providential care. And sleep was the ultimate enactment of that trust, a nightly surrender of his own capacities, a peaceful reliance on the one who neither slumbers nor sleeps, yet who grants sleep to his beloved. The profound darkness that filled his sleeping chamber was not threatening. It was a sacred veil, shielding him from the distractions of the sensory world, creating the perfect conditions for the deepest levels of physical and spiritual restoration. It was the darkness of the deep earth, nurturing the unseen roots of great trees. It was the darkness of the star-filled cosmos, against which the divine light of distant galaxies shines most brilliantly. It was the primordial darkness upon which God had first spoken the word light and brought forth creation. And in this personal, sanctified darkness, Jonah was not lost, but found, not empty, but being filled, not alone, but in the most intimate communion with the source of all being. He had willingly entered this fertile void, trusting in the divine alchemy that transforms weariness into strength, anxiety into peace, and the shadow of uncertainty into the quiet dawn of renewed hope. An unshakable sense of being utterly known, completely understood, and unconditionally loved was the very atmosphere his spirit breathed in this deep slumber. It was a love that required no merit, no performance, no perfection on his part. It was pure, unadulterated grace, freely given, lavishly bestowed. This assurance was the invisible foundation upon which the entire edifice of his peace was built. It allowed him to release all pretense, all fear, all striving, and to simply be a beloved child resting securely in the everlasting arms. This was the ultimate true north for his soul, the unmoving pole star of God's love, around which his entire being could revolve in perfect harmonious rest. The constellations continued their majestic, silent procession across the immense canvas of the night sky, their patterns a timeless testament to a divine order and an inscrutable wisdom. The ocean whispered its ancient secrets to the base of the cliffs below. The wind sang its lonely, high country song around the weathered stones of the Sea-Watch Tower. And within its quiet, candleless sleeping chamber, Jonah Alistair Finch, master cartographer and faithful servant of the light, slept on, his journey taking him through the unmapped, luminous territories of divine peace, his spirit being meticulously recharted, renewed, and prepared by the loving hand of the great navigator for the voyage of another day. The charts of heaven were being subtly inscribed upon his soul, and all was profoundly, wonderfully well. The deepest, most inviolable heart of the night now held Jonah Alistair Finch in its profound and tranquil embrace. His consciousness, that tireless cartographer of his waking hours, had sailed far beyond the farthest charted islands of thought and sensation into a boundless starlit ocean of pure, unadulterated peace. In this sacred realm, the physical world of his sea-watch tower, its ancient, weathered stones, the rhythmic, distant pulse of the Porthcarrick lighthouse, the eternal, sighing cadence of the northern ocean against the cliffs below, was but a faint, almost forgotten whisper, a dreamlike echo on the shores of a reality infinitely more serene, infinitely more vast. His breathing, now so slow, so shallow as to be almost imperceptible, was the gentle, rhythmic swell of this inner ocean, a testament to the profound rest that had claimed him. Body, soul, and spirit. He was no longer the meticulous scholar, the guardian of nautical knowledge. He was simply a soul at anchor in the safe, boundless harbor of God's presence, his vessel of selfhood gently rocking in the cradle of an eternal, loving calm. In this sanctum of deep unconsciousness, where the vigilant sentinels of the intellect stand down and the soul lies open and receptive, the most profound and often hidden works of divine restoration are performed. For Jonah, these were not hours of mere emptiness or oblivion, but a period of sacred, silent transformation. It was as if the divine alchemist, with an infinitely gentle and skillful hand, was at work within the deepest recesses of his being, transmuting the leaden weight of accumulated weariness into the pure gold of renewed vitality, dissolving the subtle dross of unspoken anxieties in the purifying fire of unconditional love, and repolishing the sometimes tarnished silver of his spirit until it reflected with pristine clarity the image of its maker. This was a healing that transcended the merely physical, a recreation that touched the very essence of his being, all accomplished in a stillness so profound, a silence so complete, that it was the very language of God. If dreams, those ephemeral travelers of the night, still journeyed through the landscapes of his dormant mind, they were not the sharp-edged, often perplexing narratives of lighter sleep, born of the day's unresolved concerns, or the mind's restless sorting. Instead, they were more akin to pure, unmediated experiences of the numinous, a sensation, perhaps, of being effortlessly suspended in a boundless, luminous void where all questions dissolved, and only a profound, joyful knowing remained. Or he might feel himself to be a single, pure note in an infinite, celestial symphony, a harmony so perfect, so overwhelmingly beautiful, that it was the very sound of God's being resonating through him, retuning every fiber of his soul to its original divine pitch. These were not visions to be captured or experiences to be articulated, but rather profound, ineffable encounters with the sacred, subtle spiritual infusions that were realigning his entire being with the fundamental eternal truths of love, peace, and belonging. He had often marveled in his waking reflections at the biblical concept of the hidden manna, the spiritual sustenance that God provides for his people in ways often unseen, often unexpected. He thought of the prophet Elijah, fed by ravens in the wilderness, a stark, improbable provision in a time of desperate need. Or the Israelites, sustained for 40 years by bread from heaven, a daily miracle that defied all human understanding. Jonah felt, with a certainty that permeated even his unconscious state, that this deep, restorative sleep was a form of that hidden manna for his soul. It was a nourishment provided in the wilderness of the night, a spiritual sustenance that replenished his deepest reserves, strengthened his inner fortitude, and prepared him in ways he could never fully comprehend for the ongoing voyage of his life. This was not a rest he earned through his diligent work, but a gift he received through his trusting surrender. The very stones of his sea-watch tower, ancient and enduring, seemed to participate in this profound nocturnal peace. They had stood for centuries against the fury of Atlantic gales, against the relentless erosion of time, immutable sentinels on this rugged headland. And Jonah, sleeping soundly within their protective embrace, felt an unconscious resonance with their steadfastness, their quiet strength. He too was called to be a landmark, a point of reference, in his own sphere. And he knew at a level deeper than thought that the capacity for such endurance, such unwavering fidelity, was not self-generated, but was drawn from a source as ancient, as powerful, and as reliable as the bedrock upon which his tower was built: the unchanging, omnipotent love of God. His peace was not the fragile calm of a sheltered inlet, but the deep, resilient peace of an ocean whose surface might be troubled, but whose depths remained eternally serene, anchored to the very foundations of the earth. He recalled the image of God presented in the Psalms as a shepherd, leading his flock to green pastures and still waters, restoring their souls. Even in the profound oblivion of his sleep, Jonah's spirit was being gently led through those inner green pastures, was being refreshed by those inner still waters. The pastures were not physical places, but states of profound spiritual nourishment, where his soul could graze on the abundance of God's grace. The still waters were not literal streams, but the deep, untroubled pools of divine peace within him, reflecting clarity and truth. His soul, weary from the long voyage of life, with its inevitable storms and its stretches of becalmed uncertainty, was indeed being restored, its sails mended, its hull strengthened, its compass recalibrated, by the loving, skillful hand of the divine shepherd. The profound darkness that filled his sleeping chamber, a darkness unmitigated now by even the faintest candlelight or the last glow of embers, was not a void to be feared, but a sacred, fertile emptiness, like the primordial void upon which the Spirit of God had brooded at the dawn of time, preparing to bring forth light and life. It was the darkness of the chrysalis, where the unseen miraculous transformation from caterpillar to butterfly occurs. It was the darkness of the deep earth, where the seed, seemingly dead, holds the irrepressible promise of resurrection and new growth. And in this personal, sanctified darkness, Jonah was not merely absent from the world. He was present, in a unique and profound way, to the work of recreation within his own being. He had willingly embraced this temporary death of his conscious self, trusting in the divine power that could bring forth new life, new strength, new peace, from the very heart of that surrender. An unshakable, though entirely unconscious, sense of being utterly and completely safe, of being held in an embrace that was both infinitely powerful and exquisitely tender, formed the very atmosphere of his sleep. It was a security that transcended any physical fortress, any human protection. It was the security of a soul at home in God, a soul that knew, with a certainty beyond all doubt, that it was infinitely precious, perfectly understood, and unconditionally loved. This was the ultimate anchor, the unmoving center around which the storms of life might rage without ever truly disturbing the profound inner calm. This was the peace of God that passes all understanding, not because it was irrational, but because its foundations lay in a reality far deeper, far more eternal than the shifting sands of human comprehension. The constellations, those ancient mariners' guides, continued their silent, majestic journey across the vast, dark dome of the heavens, their patterns an eternal testament to a cosmic order, a divine intelligence that held all things in their appointed paths. The great northern ocean sighed its timeless secrets against the unyielding cliffs. The night wind whispered its lonely, ethereal song around the weathered stones of the sea-watch tower, and within its deepest, most secluded chamber, Jonah Alistair Finch, master of earthly charts, slept on, his own small vessel of life now navigating the luminous, unchartable waters of divine peace, his spirit being subtly reshaped, renewed, and filled to overflowing by the boundless grace of the great navigator, the eternal source of all light, all life, and all true, enduring rest. The night was at its zenith of stillness, and the keeper of the sea watch, himself profoundly kept, was immersed in a peace as deep and as boundless as the Father's love. The deepest, most profound stillness of the mid-autumn night enveloped Jonah's sea watch tower, a silence so complete it seemed to be the very breath of eternity, broken only by the distant, rhythmic sigh of the ocean against the granite cliffs, a sound as ancient and as soothing as a cosmic lullaby. Within his small, stone-walled sleeping chamber, Jonah Alistair Finch lay utterly immersed in a sleep that transcended mere physical repose. It was a sacred journey into the heart of divine peace, a state where the meticulous cartographer of waking life became a willing, surrendered recipient of a grace that recharted the innermost landscapes of his soul. The candles in his study above had long since burned down, their flickering light replaced by the faint, ethereal glow of starlight filtering through the deeply embrasured windows, and the Porthcarrick lighthouse, a distant, friendly sentinel, continued its unwavering, sweeping vigil, its beam a silent, rhythmic pulse in the vast, surrounding darkness, a pulse that resonated, unconsciously, with the profound, steady peace that now filled Jonah's entire being. In this sanctuary of profound unconsciousness, where the clamor of the world and the anxieties of the mind are utterly silenced, the spirit becomes like a perfectly still, deep pool, capable of reflecting with flawless clarity the overarching, starlit sky of God's infinite presence. For Jonah, these were not hours of mere emptiness or suspended animation, but a period of profound, active, though entirely passive on his part, spiritual osmosis. It was as if the very atmosphere of heaven, thick with love, joy, and ineffable peace, was seeping into his soul, displacing any lingering shadows of doubt, any residual dust of weariness, any faint, discordant notes of discontent. This was a divine saturation, a gentle, irresistible infilling, orchestrated by a love that knew his deepest needs even before his conscious mind could articulate them, a love that worked its restorative magic in the hidden, fertile darkness of his surrendered self. If his dormant mind, in its mysterious, nocturnal wanderings, conjured any forms or fleeting impressions, they were not the earthbound narratives of daily life or the unsettling phantoms of unresolved fears. Instead, they were more likely to be abstract, luminous experiences of pure being, a sensation, perhaps, of being dissolved into an infinite ocean of warm, golden light, where all sense of individual limitation vanished, replaced by a joyful, expansive sense of belonging to everything, of being an integral, cherished part of a vast, benevolent, and perfectly harmonious whole. Or he might experience a feeling of being gently lifted, carried effortlessly on currents of pure, unconditional love towards a destination of unimaginable beauty and serenity, a place where all striving ceased, and only a profound, blissful rest remained. These were not dreams to be analyzed for their symbolic content, but rather divine caresses, spiritual nourishment, subtle but powerful realignments of his soul with the ultimate reality of God's eternal goodness and peace. He had often, in his waking hours, pondered the mystery of God's creative power, the sheer mind-boggling artistry evident in the intricate spiral of a seashell, the delicate tracery of a frost-covered window pane, the vast, ordered majesty of the constellations. He saw in his own work as a cartographer a humble attempt to reflect, to understand, to participate in that divine ordering of the world. And he had come to believe that this same creative, ordering power was at work in the microcosm of his own being during these hours of deep, surrendered sleep. Just as God had brought forth light from darkness and order from chaos at the dawn of creation, so too, Jonah felt, was the divine artist at work in the darkness of his unconsciousness, bringing forth inner light from any residual shadows, re-establishing inner order where the day's small chaoses might have intruded, gently reshaping his spirit according to its original, perfect, God-given design. This was not a passive state. It was a period of profound, divine recreation. The ancient stones of the Sea-Watch Tower, which had stood for centuries as a bulwark against the sometimes ferocious assaults of the North Atlantic storms, seemed to impart a sense of their own, enduring strength, their unshakable solidity, to his sleeping form. He was, in a way, as much a part of this tower as the stones themselves, his life interwoven with its history, its purpose, its very fabric. And just as the tower found its ultimate security in its deep foundations, anchored to the unyielding bedrock of the headland, so Jonah, in his deep sleep, found his ultimate security in the unshakable eternal bedrock of God's faithfulness. This was a peace that was not dependent on the absence of external storms, but on the certainty of an inner refuge, a divine fortress against which the tempests of life could beat without ever breaching the walls of his soul's deepest sanctuary. He remembered the biblical accounts of Jesus often withdrawing to solitary places to pray, sometimes spending entire nights in communion with his Father. These periods of quiet, intense fellowship were, Jonah understood, the source of Jesus' incredible strength, his profound wisdom, his unwavering peace, even in the face of immense suffering and opposition. While Jonah's own nightly rest was far humbler, far less consciously intense, he believed that it too was a form of sacred withdrawal, a necessary detaching from the world's demands in order to reconnect with and be refilled by the divine source of all life and all peace. It was in these hidden hours of seeming inactivity that the true wellsprings of his spiritual vitality were replenished, enabling him to meet his waking duties not from a place of depletion, but from a place of quiet, resilient fullness. The profound darkness that now filled his sleeping chamber, a darkness as complete and as velvety as the inside of a geode, before it is cracked open to reveal its hidden crystals, was a necessary condition for this deep, restorative work. It was a darkness that invited surrender, that discouraged the restless striving of the conscious mind, that allowed the body's innate healing wisdom to function without interference. It was the darkness of the fertile soil, essential for the germination of a seed. It was the darkness of the deep, quiet pool, where sediments settle and clarity is restored. And in this sacred enfolding darkness, Jonah was not lost or abandoned. He was being tenderly held, meticulously mended, profoundly renewed, by a love that sees in the dark, a power that works in the unseen, a wisdom that operates beyond the confines of human understanding. An unshakable, though entirely unconscious, conviction of his own intrinsic worth, his belovedness in the eyes of God, was the silent, luminous atmosphere that permeated his entire being. This was not pride or self-aggrandizement, but a simple, humble acceptance of the astonishing truth of grace, that he was loved not for what he did, not for his skill as a cartographer or his diligence as a keeper, but simply for who he was, a child of God, created in his image, redeemed by his love. This profound, unearned sense of being cherished was the ultimate antidote to all fear, all anxiety, all sense of inadequacy. It was the softest pillow, the warmest blanket, the most secure harbor for his weary soul. It was the peace that flowed from perfect acceptance, perfect love. The constellations, those timeless celestial charts, continued their slow, majestic procession across the deep, dark velvet of the night sky, their silent, distant light a constant reminder of an order, a beauty, a faithfulness that transcended all earthly comprehension. The great northern ocean breathed its ancient rhythmic sigh against the steadfast cliffs. The night wind whispered its solitary eternal song around the weathered stones of the Sea-Watch Tower, and within its most secluded, lightless chamber, Jonah Alistair Finch, the humble student of earthly maps, slept on, his own spirit now navigating the luminous, unchartable oceans of divine peace, his inner landscape being gently redrawn, his soul's coordinates being lovingly recalibrated by the unerring hand of the divine cartographer, the eternal source of all true direction, all lasting rest, all perfect, boundless love. The night was a holy sanctuary, and its solitary keeper was profoundly, blessedly at peace. The very heart of the night, that profound mystical interlude when the temporal world seems to hold its breath in deference to the eternal, now enfolded Jonah Alistair Finch in its deepest, most tranquil embrace. His consciousness, having journeyed far beyond the meticulously charted territories of his waking life, was now immersed in an ocean of peace so vast, so serene, it felt like the native element of his soul, a return to a primal state of perfect, untroubled union with his Creator. The physical reality of his Sea-Watch Tower, with its ancient, wind-scoured stones and the distant, rhythmic sweep of the Porthcarrick Lighthouse, had receded to an almost unimaginable distance, like a faint, dreamlike echo on the farthest shores of a boundless, starlit sea. His breathing, now as slow, as even, and as almost imperceptible as the gentle molecular exchange between the sleeping earth and the silent, watchful cosmos, was the only tangible sign of the life held within his resting form, a life now utterly surrendered to and sustained by the restorative, healing energies of God's infinite peace. In this sacred chamber of profound unconsciousness, where the restless loom of the analytical mind is completely stilled, and the soul's carefully constructed ramparts are willingly lowered, the most intimate and transformative works of divine grace are often performed. For Jonah, these were not hours of mere oblivion or absence, but a period of sacred, silent alchemy. It was as if the divine healer, with an infinitely tender and unerring touch, was moving through the deepest, most hidden corridors of his being, gently cleansing any residual toxins of fear or doubt, patiently mending the almost invisible hairline fractures that life's struggles and sorrows inevitably inflict upon the spirit, and slowly, lovingly, polishing the occasionally dimmed facets of his soul until they reflected with renewed brilliance the pure, unwavering light of their Maker. This was a profound cellular reattunement, a reharmonization with the divine symphony, all accomplished in a stillness so absolute, a silence so resonant, that it was the very voice of God speaking peace to his innermost depths. If his dormant mind, in its mysterious nocturnal navigations, still hosted any fleeting forms or impressions, they were far removed from the concrete, definable shapes of his earthly charts or the sequential logic of his conscious reasoning. Instead, they were more likely to be pure, unmediated experiences of divine attributes, a profound sense of being utterly enveloped in a love so immense, so unconditional, it dissolved all sense of unworthiness or separation, leaving only a joyful, overwhelming awareness of belonging. Or he might experience a timeless, formless journey through an infinite expanse of compassionate understanding, where all his life's questions, all his unspoken yearnings, were met not with answers, but with a peace that transcended the need. For them, a profound sense of being perfectly known, perfectly accepted. These were not dreams to be catalogued or interpreted. They were spiritual immersions, sacred encounters that were subtly reordering his soul's priorities, realigning his deepest desires with the eternal will of God, steeping him in a love that was beyond all telling, a peace that was beyond all earthly compare. He had often reflected in his waking studies of Scripture on the concept of God's Sabbath rest, not merely as a cessation from labor, but as a participation in God's own perfect, completed joy, a state of being where all striving ceases because all is well, all is held, all is good. He thought of the creation narrative, where God, having completed his work, rested, and in that divine rest, there was a sense of profound satisfaction, of perfect fulfillment. Jonah felt, with a certainty that permeated even the deepest layers of his unconsciousness, that this profound, God-given sleep was his own small human echo of that divine Sabbath. It was a time when he ceased from all his own charting, all his own efforts to navigate and understand, and simply rested in the finished work of God, in the perfect love that held him, in the perfect peace that was his true eternal home. This was not passivity born of weariness, but a conscious, trusting alignment with the ultimate source of all peace and all renewal. The ancient, steadfast stones of his sea-watch tower, mute witnesses to centuries of human endeavor, and the relentless power of the elements seemed to resonate with the profound peace that filled their current keeper. They were a symbol of endurance, of refuge, of a strength that was not self-generated but was drawn from foundations laid deep in the earth. And Jonah, sleeping soundly within their time-worn embrace, felt an unconscious connection to that enduring strength. He knew at a level far beneath conscious thought that his own true foundation was not in his skill, not in his knowledge, not even in the physical security of his tower, but in the immutable, eternal rock of ages, the unshakable faithfulness of God. This profound, unarticulated trust was the very bedrock of his peace, allowing his spirit to rest with an abandon, a completeness that few ever experience. He remembered the words of Jesus to Martha, who was worried and upset about many things, while Mary had chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. The simple act of sitting at the Lord's feet, of listening, of being in his presence. Jonah understood that much of his waking life, like Martha's, was necessarily filled with many things: the demands of his meticulous craft, the responsibilities of his solitary post. But these nightly hours of deep, surrendered sleep were his merry moment, a time of choosing the one thing needful, the quiet, receptive posture at the feet of the Master, where true peace was found, where the soul was nourished, where strength for all other things was quietly, abundantly bestowed. This was not an escape from his duties, but the very source of his ability to perform them with grace, with diligence, and with an underlying current of profound, joyful peace. The profound darkness that filled his high, stone-walled sleeping chamber, a darkness now absolute, untroubled by even the faintest glimmer of external light, was not a menacing void, but a sacred, fertile darkness, like the deep, rich soil in which a seemingly lifeless seed holds the astonishing promise of a mighty tree. It was the darkness of the deep, silent places of the earth where precious metals and life-giving springs are hidden. It was the primordial darkness upon which the Spirit of God had hovered, pregnant with all the potential of a universe yet to be born. And in this personal, holy darkness, Jonah was not diminishing or disappearing. He was being profoundly recreated, his spirit gently unmade from the weariness of the world, and lovingly remade in the image of divine serenity, his inner landscape being quietly irrigated by the hidden rivers of God's grace. He had willingly stepped into this temporary nothingness of sleep, trusting in the divine power that specializes in bringing forth everything from nothing, light from darkness, life from apparent death. An unshakable, though entirely unconscious, sense of his own infinite value, his absolute belovedness in the sight of his Creator, was the silent, luminous air his spirit breathed in this deep, restorative slumber. It was a love that was not contingent on his achievements as a cartographer, nor on his virtues as a man, but was poured out upon him freely, extravagantly, simply because he was. This profound awareness of being unconditionally cherished, deeply embedded in the very marrow of his soul, was the ultimate solace, the final antidote to any lingering trace of human fear, any shadow of existential loneliness. It was the softest, most secure resting place, the warmest, most encompassing embrace. It was the peace that comes not from understanding, but from belonging. The great, silent, wheeling tapestry of the constellations, those celestial charts drawn by the hand of God Himself, continued its majestic, timeless journey across the infinite. Black velvet of the night sky, each distant star a spark of divine light, a whisper of eternal order. The vast northern ocean whispered its ancient rhythmic secrets to the unyielding granite feet of the headland. The night wind sang its solitary, ethereal plainsong around the age-old stones of the sea-watch tower, and within its deepest, most secluded, lightless heart, Jonah Alistair Finch, the humble earthly guardian of lines and boundaries, slept on, his own soul now navigating the uncharted, luminous infinity of divine peace, his inner coordinates being, lovingly, perfectly recalibrated by the unerring wisdom of the great navigator, the eternal, compassionate source of all true guidance, all profound rest, all perfect, boundless, and everlasting love. The night reigned in its deepest stillness, and the keeper of the sea-watch, himself profoundly and blessedly kept, was immersed in a peace as fathomless and as life-giving as the very heart of God. As the profoundest depths of the night began their almost imperceptible, slow pivot towards the still distant promise of dawn, the quality of Jonah Alistair Finch's sleep, while losing none of its deep restorative power, commenced a subtle, graceful evolution. It was not an awakening from peace, but rather a gentle stirring within that peace, like the first faintest breath of wind across the surface of a vast, perfectly still ocean, a ripple that hints at an eventual return to movement but does not yet disturb the profound calm of the depths. The absolute oblivion of the midnight hours, where his individual consciousness had been almost entirely subsumed in the boundless presence of the divine, started to give way to a state still profoundly restful, yet perhaps permitting the most delicate, almost subliminal re-emergence of his own unique spirit within that encompassing, loving communion. The ancient steadfast stones of the sea-watch tower stood as silent, unwavering sentinels, and the rhythmic, distant pulse of the Porthcarrick lighthouse continued its lonely, faithful vigil, its beam now cutting through a darkness that, though still immense, held the faintest, almost undetectable premonition of a light yet to come, a premonition that resonated, at the deepest unconscious levels, with the gentle, preparatory shifts occurring within Jonah's own being. Imagine a master craftsman having completed the most intricate and vital restoration of a rare, priceless artifact in the deep, focused silence of his workshop, now beginning to gently remove the protective coverings, allowing the ambient light to slowly reaccustom the object to its presence, ensuring that the transition from sheltered darkness to eventual display is not jarring, but perfectly graduated. So it felt as if the divine craftsman, having tended to the deepest, most essential repairs and renewals within Jonah's soul, was now commencing the most subtle, tender process of reintroducing his spirit to the peripheries of sensory awareness. The profound peace was not being withdrawn, it was being meticulously integrated, becoming less an external environment and more an intrinsic, luminous quality of his renewed self, ready to be carried with him into the waking world, not as a fragile memory, but as a resilient, indwelling reality. The absolute physical stillness that had characterized his deepest slumber might have begun to yield in the most infinitesimal ways. A slight unconscious shift in the drape of his hand upon the woolen quilt, a barely perceptible deepening of his breath as his lungs drew in the cool, salt-tinged air with a fraction more subtle awareness. These were not the restless movements of disturbed sleep, but rather the first, faint signals of a body that had been thoroughly mended, every cell rejuvenated, and was now, in its own innate, ancient wisdom, beginning its slow, organic preparation for the eventual return to life and activity. It was like the almost invisible internal shift within a dormant seed, responding to the faintest, most distant cues of changing temperature and light. A silent, potent stirring of the life force within, heralding the eventual, miraculous unfurling into a new season. His muscles, having been completely absolved of every trace of fatigue, now lay in a state of quiescent readiness, imbued with a fresh, clean, and gentle energy, awaiting the eventual soft summons to arise. In this delicately transitional phase, as his consciousness drifted in the serene, sun-dappled shallows just beneath the surface of full wakefulness, any inner experiences, any dreamlike fragments, would continue to be gentle, affirming, and deeply imbued with the tranquility that had saturated his entire nocturnal journey. Perhaps a fleeting, peaceful sensation of effortlessly charting a course across a perfectly calm, luminous sea, every star in its proper place, every current favorable, or the comforting feeling of being enveloped in a warm, embracing light, a light that whispered of unconditional love and infinite understanding. These were not the intrusive, demanding narratives of an unquiet mind, but rather the soft, harmonious echoes of the peace and order that had been profoundly re-established within his soul, like the last, beautiful, fading notes of a celestial melody, gently preparing him for the more prosaic, yet still sacred sounds of the waking world. They were like gentle, encouraging emissaries from the heart of his own deepest, truest self, affirming his identity, his purpose, his belovedness. The ancient, unyielding presence of the headland upon which his tower stood, though not consciously perceived, seemed to exert a subtle, grounding influence even upon his sleeping state. Its immense, silent strength, its rootedness in the very fabric of the earth, was a palpable, though subliminal reality, a reminder of endurance, of things that are steadfast and true, the rhythmic distant sigh of the ocean, that vast, breathing entity that had been the constant soundtrack to his life, might now begin to register at a more subtly defined level, not as a collection of specific wave sounds, but as a comforting, all-encompassing pulse, an auditory heartbeat of the planet that was also, in some mysterious way, deeply connected to the rhythm of his own peaceful heart. His profound disconnection from the external world was beginning a slow, almost imperceptible reversal, as his senses, one by tiny one, prepared to re-engage, but to do so from a place of deep, unshakable inner serenity. Consider the biblical narratives of Jesus appearing to his disciples in the quiet, liminal hours of early morning, often after a night of their own toil or uncertainty. His presence invariably brought peace, a dispelling of fear, a renewed sense of hope and divine commission. Jonah, in his own far humbler experience, as he hovered in this sacred pre-dawn space between the depths of sleep and the clarity of full awareness, was not anticipating a visible apparition, but he was profoundly experiencing a similar sense of divine companionship, a quiet, unwavering assurance that the God who had been his sanctuary through the night would also be his guide, and his strength through the coming day. This was not a peace that would evaporate with the morning mist, but one that was being carefully prepared to greet the dawn alongside him, robust and resilient. The profound sense of security, of being utterly safe and tenderly, powerfully held, which had been the unshakable foundation of his night's entire restorative journey, remained completely intact, its truth now woven into the very warp and woof of his being. This was not a fragile peace, dependent on stillness or isolation, easily shattered by the first demands of the waking world. It was a deep, strong, resilient calm, fortified by hours of uninterrupted, grace-filled communion with the divine. This intrinsic security, this indwelling shalom, was what would allow him to transition smoothly and peacefully into full wakefulness, without the jarring disorientation or the sudden resurgence of anxieties that can sometimes accompany a less complete or less surrendered rest. He was being gently, skillfully reacclimated, his spirit slowly but surely recalibrating to the frequencies of the waking world, all while being continuously enfolded in that perfect, seamless, divine serenity. Imagine a deep, artesian well, its waters crystal clear, cool and life-giving, a well whose source is so abundant it remains perpetually full, no matter how much is drawn from it. Jonah's spirit, having been filled to overflowing with the living water of God's peace throughout the long sacred hours of the night, was now in this blessed state. As he began his slow, gentle ascent towards the surface of conscious awareness, he would be drawing upon this bounteous inner resource. Yet the divine spring from which it flowed, the infinite, inexhaustible love and grace of God, remained undiminished, ever present, ever flowing. This unspoken, deeply felt understanding contributed significantly to the profound calm that accompanied his gradual emergence from the depths of sleep. He knew, with a certainty that transcended all intellectual formulation, that he would not awaken to an inner emptiness or a spiritual drought, but to a fullness that would sustain him, empower him, and guide him through whatever the new day might hold. The profound darkness within his stone-walled sleeping chamber, though still prevailing, was perhaps losing some of its most absolute inky density, subtly, almost imperceptibly, yielding to the faintest premonition of the gray light that precedes the true dawn, a light that would first touch the highest eastern-facing peaks far beyond his tower. This was not a change he would consciously register with his eyes, still gently closed, but his body's own exquisitely sensitive internal chronometers, perfectly attuned to the ancient primal cycles of light and darkness, would be responding, at a cellular level, to these minute environmental cues, gently guiding his entire physiology towards the waking state. The delicate, intricate dance of hormones that had facilitated and maintained his deep restorative sleep was now slowly, precisely beginning to reconfigure, paving the anointing way for a natural, peaceful, and entirely unforced awakening. All of this intricate, divine orchestration was occurring beneath the tranquil surface of his continued repose, a masterful, loving preparation for his re-entry into the world of light and purposeful activity. The great Porthcarrick lighthouse, its beam as faithful and as unwavering as the pole star itself, continued its silent, sweeping ministry over the dark, restless waters of the Northern Ocean, and Jonah Alistair Finch, the humble human keeper of the Sea-Watch, rested on, his own inner lamp having been meticulously trimmed, refueled, and made ready by an unseen, infinitely skillful hand. He was being prepared not just to open his eyes to another day, but to meet that day with a spirit profoundly renewed, a heart deeply at peace, and a body fully restored, ready to continue his quiet, steadfast service under the ever-watchful, infinitely loving gaze of the great navigator of all souls. The transition from the sacred, holy stillness of the night to the gentle, expectant stirrings of the dawn was as much a part of God's precious gift of rest as the deepest oblivion. Had been a final, tender act of divine care, ensuring a perfect, peaceful arrival on the shores of a new morning. The gentle, almost imperceptible tide of approaching wakefulness had now carried Jonah Alistair Finch from the profound, silent depths of his nocturnal voyage to the calm, sheltered waters just off the familiar coastline of full consciousness. The extraordinary peace that had been his constant, unwavering atmosphere throughout the night was not fading or diminishing. Rather, it felt as if it were consolidating within the very core of his being, transforming from an all-encompassing, ethereal mist of serenity into a quiet, steadfast, and luminous inner sun, a radiant source of warmth and light that would soon illuminate his first conscious perceptions of the new day. His body, while still enveloped in a profound and delicious relaxation, was losing the absolute stone-like inertia that had characterized midnight's deepest surrender. A minute, unconscious adjustment of his head on the old linen pillow, a barely perceptible quickening in the even rhythm of his breathing as it drew in the cool, salt-laced air with a subtly increasing awareness. These were not the fitful stirrings of disturbed sleep, but the soft initial movements of a physical vessel that had been thoroughly repaired, refueled, and was now, in its own unhurried organic time, preparing to re-engage with the world of action and sensation. The ancient Sea-Watch Tower stood as it had for centuries, its highest stones perhaps just beginning to catch the first, palest, most ethereal rays of a dawn still hidden below the eastern horizon. And Jonah, its faithful keeper, was an intrinsic part of this timeless sacred cycle of profound rest and gentle, divinely orchestrated renewal, his awakening as natural and as perfectly timed as the sunrise itself. Imagine a master horologist, a craftsman of exquisite timepieces, having meticulously cleaned and perfectly recalibrated a complex, ancient chronometer through the focused silence of the night, now gently setting its finely wrought hands in motion, preparing it to once again measure the passage of day with flawless, harmonious precision. So Jonah's inner being, his intricate mechanism of thought, feeling, and spirit, felt as if it were being gently reanimated by the divine horologist. The absolute stillness of his inner world, the suspension of all conscious processing, was giving way to the first, faint, exquisitely ordered ticks of sensory awareness. But these initial perceptions were pure, clear, and perfectly synchronized with the deep, abiding peace that had become the fundamental resonant frequency of his soul. The journey back from the silent depths was not a jarring, abrupt ascent, but a graceful, melodic unfolding, each stage guided by an unseen, infinitely skillful, and loving hand. The subtle sounds from the world beyond the thick, protective stone walls of his tower, which for many hours had been either entirely unheard or merely part of an undifferentiated, soothing hum on the very outermost periphery of his subconscious, began to crystallize into more recognizable, though still pleasantly distant and unthreatening, elements. The rhythmic, sighing cadence of the surf at the base of the headland, the sound that was the very heartbeat of his solitary existence, might acquire a slightly more distinct articulation. The separate sounds of incoming and retreating waves, becoming discernible. The whisper of the wind around the tower's weathered crenellations, a sound as familiar to him as his own name, might carry a clearer, more defined soughing, its voice no longer just a murmur, but a soft, ancient song. These sounds, still perceived through a thick, comforting and insulating layer of profound inner peace, were not yet intrusions or demands. They were more like gentle, familiar heralds, respectfully announcing their presence to his slowly awakening perception, reacquainting his mind with its unique and cherished environment. His deep, almost mystical connection to this wild and windswept place, his cartographer's sensitivity to its subtle nuances, was being tenderly, gradually re-established. In this serene, liminal borderland, this tranquil, sun-dappled estuary, between the vast ocean of sleep and the firm land of full wakefulness, any ephemeral dream images or fleeting thoughts would be imbued with an extraordinary gentleness, clarity, and peace. He might experience a fleeting, peaceful vision of himself, looking out from his tower at a sea of impossible calm, its surface like polished silver under a benevolent, cloudless sky. Or perhaps the comforting, almost tangible sensation of a guiding hand resting lightly on his shoulder, a silent assurance of unwavering companionship and unerring direction. These were not the anxious, problem-solving fragments of an unquiet or incompletely rested mind, but rather the soft, luminous afterglow of a spirit that had been thoroughly bathed in divine light, its usual preoccupations washed clean, its perspective restored to one of simple, unshakable trust and quiet, joyful faith. They were like the first perfect dewdrops of a new day, reflecting the pure, unsullied light of his renewed soul, gently preparing him for the more complex, yet still sacred tapestry of his waking hours. The physical sensations of his immediate environment, the comforting realities of his small, austere sleeping chamber, were becoming increasingly distinct and defined. He could clearly feel the specific texture of the coarse, hand-woven linen sheets against his skin, the way his old, feather-stuffed pillow conformed perfectly to the curve of his neck and head, the subtle, refreshing coolness of the sea air on the small portion of his face left uncovered by the thick woolen quilt. An almost involuntary, slow, luxurious sigh of deep contentment might escape his lips, a physical manifestation of the profound, pervasive well-being that permeated every cell, every fiber of his entire being. His body, having been completely and meticulously restored, its every system rejuvenated during the sacred healing hours of the night, was now calmly, confidently signaling its readiness to embrace the new day, not with a jarring urgency, but with a quiet, resilient, and inherent vitality. The profound, muscle-deep relaxation remained, but it was now infused with a latent, joyful energy, like a perfectly tuned stringed instrument, its vibrations stilled but ready to resonate with the first touch of the musician's hand. Consider the biblical promise, so often a source of comfort to Jonah in his waking hours. "The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night." He felt the deep, experiential truth of those words now, as he hovered in this peaceful state. The moon of the night's potential anxieties or hidden fears had not struck him. Instead, he had been kept, sheltered, profoundly shaded by the divine presence. And he knew, with an unshakable certainty, that the same keeper who had guarded his vulnerable sleep would also be his shade, his protection, his guide, through the sun of the coming day, with all its demands, its challenges, and its opportunities. This unwavering assurance of God's constant, encompassing, and personal care was the unyielding bedrock of his peace, the source of his quiet, resilient courage. The extraordinary peace that had been his sacred sanctuary, his constant companion, and his divine protector throughout the long, dark hours of the night now felt less like an external environment that he inhabited, and more like an intrinsic, inseparable quality of his own renewed spirit, as if his very soul had absorbed and been transformed by its divine essence. This indwelling peace, this quiet, luminous core of serenity, was his steadfast anchor, his unerring compass, as he neared the very threshold of the waking world. It was indeed the peace of God which surpasses all understanding, acting now as a wise, gentle, and discerning gatekeeper, ensuring that his first conscious thoughts, his initial perceptions of the new day, would be received into an atmosphere of serene acceptance, of quiet gratitude, not into a sudden, overwhelming resurgence of worldly anxieties or unresolved concerns. This was the most precious, the most enduring, the most transformative gift of his night of completely surrendered, divinely bestowed rest, not just a temporary respite from weariness, but a lasting, qualitative change in the very climate of his inner world. Imagine a masterfully crafted sailing vessel, having found safe and tranquil harbor through a long, tempestuous night, now resting peacefully on mirror-still waters in a sheltered, sun-drenched cove, as the first, clear light of a new dawn illuminates the world. The fury of the storm is a distant, almost forgotten memory. The weariness of the arduous voyage has been entirely dispelled by profound rest, and there is now a sense of joyful, peaceful readiness for whatever the new day's journey might hold, a quiet confidence in the seaworthiness of the vessel and the skill of its unseen captain. Jonah's passage through the night of sleep was now reaching this beautiful, serene, and triumphant conclusion. The deepest, unchartable waters of unconsciousness were now well behind him, and he was drifting with gentle, effortless grace in the calm, sun-kissed, crystal-clear shallows just off the welcoming shore of full, conscious awareness. His inner sails, which had been furled in trusting surrender, were not being hoisted with haste, but with a quiet gratitude for a voyage safely and restoratively made, his spiritual anchor of profound, unshakable peace holding him steady and secure as he prepared to step ashore into the unfolding moments, the fresh possibilities of a new day. The profound, almost tangible silence within his ancient, stone-walled sleeping chamber was now subtly, beautifully different. It was no longer the absolute, almost breathless silence of midnight's deepest point, but the more vibrant, expectant, and resonant hush of a world poised on the very brink of dawn, a silence that seemed to listen with eager anticipation for the first notes of the morning symphony. The subtle, almost imperceptible energies of the new day were gathering strength, coalescing both in the vast, awakening ocean world outside his tower and within the deeply rested, revitalized core of his own physical and spiritual being. The clean, sharp, uniquely invigorating scent of the North Atlantic at sunrise, a complex elemental perfume of salt, ozone, distant kelp, and the faintest trace of rain from a passing night shower, would be becoming more discernible to his slowly, gently reawakening olfactory sense, a familiar, beloved, and life-affirming aroma. His identity as Jonah Alistair Finch, the solitary dedicated keeper of the Sea Watch, the meticulous cartographer of coasts and currents, a man whose life was a testament to quiet faith, steadfast duty, and profound resilience, was gently, peacefully, re-emerging into his consciousness, not as a heavy mantle of responsibility, but as a cherished, well-loved and God-given vocation, now to be approached with a spirit profoundly refreshed, deeply renewed, and overflowing with an extraordinary, resilient peace. The unseen, infinitely loving hand of the great navigator, which had guided him with such exquisite tenderness into the very sanctuary of sleep, that had watched over him with unwavering, omniscient care through the darkest, most vulnerable hours, was now just as gently, just as skillfully, just as lovingly guiding him towards the clear, bright, hopeful light of a new morning. There was no abruptness, no jarring summons, no unwelcome intrusion, only a slow, graceful, perfectly organic unfurling, like an ancient, powerful tide turning with irresistible, majestic slowness towards the shore. The deep, pervasive, and utterly comforting sense of having been cherished, protected beyond measure, and unconditionally, eternally loved throughout his period of profound helplessness, was the unshakable adamantine bedrock upon which his return to the world was being confidently and peacefully built. He was approaching the act of opening his eyes to the new day not with any reluctance, not with any trepidation or lingering weariness, but with a quiet sense of profound welcome, a peaceful, almost joyful eagerness to embrace whatever the new day might hold, deeply, wonderfully fortified by a night of truly divine, exquisitely life-giving, and utterly restorative rest. The final delicate gossamer veils of sleep were now thinning to almost nothing, preparing to lift with the same ineffable tenderness and grace that had characterized his entire sacred nocturnal pilgrimage into the very heart of God's perfect, eternal peace. With a soft, almost inaudible sigh of pure, deep contentment, a breath that seemed to carry the very essence of the night's profound peace, Jonah Alistair Finch opened his eyes. He did so not with a sudden start or a reluctant peering through heavy lids, but with a slow, deliberate, and entirely peaceful unfurling, like a sea anemone gently opening its delicate tentacles to the first, life-giving currents of the morning tide. The initial light that greeted his vision was the soft, diffused pearlescence of early dawn, filtering through the single, deeply embrasured eastward-facing window of his austere sleeping chamber, painting the rough-hewn stone walls with a gentle, ethereal glow. There was no lingering grogginess, no mental fog, no disorienting residue from the depths of his slumber. Instead, his first conscious perception of the new day was experienced through an exceptionally clear, calm, and focused lens, a profound sense of intrinsic well-being that was the direct, palpable inheritance of his night-long immersion in the healing, restorative ocean of divine peace. He lay perfectly still for a few precious, suspended moments, simply observing the quiet play of light and shadow, allowing the waking world, in all its gentle morning beauty, to re-enter his senses at its own unhurried, graceful pace. The extraordinary peace he had found. The peace that had been his constant silent companion through the sacred hidden hours of darkness was not a fleeting dream. memory, soon to evaporate with the rising sun. It was a tangible, vibrant, and living reality, settled into the deepest strata of his spirit like a vein of pure, unshakable, and luminous gold. Its radiance now set to illuminate the entirety of his coming day. He took his first fully conscious breath of the new morning, a slow, deliberate inhalation that drew the cool, crisp, salt-tinged air deep into his lungs, and it felt like an act of quiet, joyful consecration, a welcoming of life in its freshest, most hopeful guise. As he exhaled, it was not with a sigh of lingering weariness or resignation, but with a soft murmur of profound gratitude, an unspoken acknowledgement of the complete and utter restoration he had experienced. He became keenly aware of his physical body, not as a collection of residual aches from the previous day's labors, or as a reluctant vessel needing to be coaxed into action, but as an instrument perfectly retuned, feeling surprisingly light, remarkably supple and infused with a quiet, resilient, and eager wholeness. He stretched, a mindful, luxurious unfolding of limbs that possessed a languid, feline grace, and the movement was not a struggle against morning stiffness or a desperate attempt to shed the shackles of torpor, but a joyful, almost celebratory greeting to his own physical form, a quiet affirmation of its renewed vitality and its readiness for purposeful engagement. Every muscle, every sinew, every nerve felt rested, responsive, and serenely alive, a testament to the deep, meticulous, cellular healing that had taken place in the sacred, protected sanctuary of his God-given, profoundly peaceful sleep. There was an exquisite, harmonious accord between his rested body and his tranquil spirit, a sense of integrated, vibrant well-being that was both a rare and an exceedingly precious gift. His gaze, clear, calm, and untroubled by any shadow of anxiety or hurriedness, traveled with gentle appreciation around the familiar, Spartan confines of his small sleeping chamber. The few simple furnishings, the sturdy, age-darkened wooden chest that held his meager wardrobe, the single, straight-backed chair, the rough stone walls themselves, their coolness a constant reminder of the tower's steadfastness, all seemed imbued this morning with a special, welcoming light, a quiet dignity. The ordinary had once again taken on an extraordinary sheen, not because the objects themselves possessed any intrinsic magic, but because his perception had been meticulously refined, lovingly polished by the long, serene hours spent in the immediate and profound presence of divine peace. He was seeing his familiar world with truly new eyes that had been thoroughly washed clean of the previous day's accumulated fatigue and the subtle, often unnoticed anxieties that can cloud one's vision. This remarkable capacity to perceive the inherent beauty, the quiet grace, and the unassuming dignity in the most familiar everyday surroundings was one of the most tangible and most cherished fruits of his truly rested, divinely renewed spirit. He felt no immediate, jarring compulsion to leap from his bed, no urgent internal clamor calling him to the duties of his post. Instead, he savored these initial, precious moments of quiet, peaceful awareness, allowing the manifold blessings of his sacred night of rest to fully permeate, to deeply saturate his conscious being like the slow, gentle warmth of the rising sun, gradually, irrevocably warming a cool, receptive stone. A profound, almost overwhelming sense of gratitude, unbidden yet intensely felt, welled up from the deepest aquifers of his spirit, as natural, as irresistible, and as life-affirming as a hidden spring breaking forth into the sunlight. It was a gratitude not for any specific, dramatic deliverance from peril or for any sudden, unexpected good fortune, but for the overarching, steadfast, and infinitely tender goodness of God Himself, for the simple, yet truly miraculous, gift of deeply restorative and profoundly peaceful sleep, for the undeniable renewal of His Spirit, for the quiet, unshakable assurance of the divine presence that had been His constant, invisible shield, and His unfailing, loving comfort throughout. the silent, vulnerable watches of the night, and which was now, with equal certainty, his indwelling strength and his serene, guiding joy in the bright, clear light of the new morning. He remembered with a detached, almost impersonal clarity the small, nebulous worries and the quiet, existential questions that had briefly cast their fleeting shadows across his thoughts the previous evening, before he had consciously, deliberately, released them into a care far greater, far wiser than his own. Now in the pristine, crystal-clear light of this new dawn, those burdens felt infinitesimally small, almost comically insignificant, their power to distress him utterly and completely neutralized, dissolved without a trace in the vast healing ocean of peace in which his soul had been so deeply and so restoratively immersed. "Thank you, my Lord and my God," he murmured, the words barely audible in the quiet solitude of his chamber, yet carrying the full, resonant weight of his sincere, overflowing heart. This was not a perfunctory, habitual prayer, born of mere duty or rote recitation, but a spontaneous, joyful overflowing of a soul brimming with an extraordinary, life-altering peace and an uncontainable, transformative thankfulness. Slowly, with a deliberate, almost regal grace that seemed to emanate from the profound, settled dignity of his renewed spirit, Jonah sat up, swinging his legs over the side of his narrow, built-in bed. His bare feet met the cool, smooth, ancient stone of the floor, a sensation that was both grounding and strangely invigorating, connecting him viscerally to the enduring, steadfast reality of his sea-watch tower, his lifelong sentinel and sanctuary. He paused for a moment, simply listening to the sounds of the early morning that drifted in through the open window. The now full-throated, joyous, and intricate chorus of the seabirds celebrating the arrival of the sun. The rhythmic, gentle, and timeless cadence of the waves washing against the granite cliffs far below, a sound that was the very elemental heartbeat of his existence in this wild, solitary place. Even the distant, almost imperceptible sounds from the mainland, the faint, far-off crowing of a rooster, the muffled chime of a village clock striking the early hour, all seemed harmonious today, perfectly orchestrated components of a larger, benevolent, and divinely ordered symphony. The profound peace that filled his own being was not threatened or diminished by these external realities. Rather, it provided a calm, serene, and unshakable center from which to perceive and engage with them in appreciative, almost reverent attention. He thought with particular clarity of the scripture that had so often been his solace and his guide. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Standing there, on the threshold of a new day, feeling the profound peace that had settled into the very marrow of his bones, witnessing the breathtaking beauty of the dawn light flooding his simple chamber, Jonah knew the truth of those ancient words, with an experiential certainty, an unarguable conviction that transcended all intellectual assent or theological rumination. The sacred, healing darkness of the night had been an undeniable testament to God's unwavering faithfulness in providing deep, restorative rest and profound spiritual renewal. The glorious, light-filled dawn was a fresh, irrefutable declaration of his never-ending, ever-present mercies, and his own heart, calm, content, and overflowing with a quiet, resilient gratitude, felt like a small, imperfect, yet sincere reflection of that great, eternal, and utterly dependable faithfulness. He was ready, truly ready, to meet this new day, not in his own limited, finite strength, which he knew from long and often painful experience to be frail, unreliable, and frequently faltering, but in the quiet, unshakable, and infinitely abundant strength that had been so generously, so lavishly poured into him during the sacred, healing, and transformative hours of his God-given, profoundly peaceful sleep. The keeper of the sea watch, the meticulous guardian of the light, was himself now filled to overflowing with an unquenchable, serene, and life-giving light, a light that would illumine his path and perhaps, in some small, unseen way, touch the lives of others he might encounter on the voyage of the day ahead. With a sense of serene purpose that flowed directly from the deep wellspring of his night's profound rest, Jonah Alastair Finch began the simple, familiar rituals of his morning. He moved from his austere sleeping chamber, up the short, winding, stone staircase, into the circular expanse of his study, the heart of his sea-watch tower. The room, already filling with the clear, invigorating light of the fully risen sun, seemed to welcome him with a silent, scholarly embrace. The scent of old parchment, beeswax, and the faint, lingering tang of India ink, overlaid with the ever-present, invigorating aroma of the sea, was a perfume he had inhaled for 4 decades, a scent synonymous with his life's work, his solitary dedication. Today, however, even these familiar sensory details seemed imbued with a heightened clarity, a subtle radiance, as if his own renewed spirit was casting its peaceful light upon everything he perceived. The great oak drafting table, with its nearly completed chart of the treacherous shoals still lying beneath its protective linen cloth, did not beckon him with an immediate, demanding call to labor. Instead it waited, patiently, a silent testament to a task well advanced, a purpose nearing its fruition. And Jonah approached it not with anxiety about its completion, nor with sadness at its impending end, but with a quiet sense of gratitude for the journey it represented, and a peaceful openness to whatever lay beyond. His first, almost instinctive action, before even considering his morning ablutions or the preparation of his simple breakfast, was to walk to each of the deeply embrasured windows of his study, a ritual he performed every morning, regardless of the weather. From the north window he surveyed the rugged, inhospitable coastline stretching towards the distant, mist-shrouded headlands. From the east he looked out over the vast, now sparkling expanse of the Northern Ocean, its surface ruffled by a brisk morning breeze, whitecaps dancing like scattered diamonds. From the south he could see the faint, smoky outline of the distant fishing port of Porthcarrick, and the reassuring, though now unlit, form of its lighthouse, his inanimate colleague, in their shared watch over these often treacherous waters. And from the western window his gaze fell upon the steep, heather-clad slopes that led down from his tower to the small, secluded cove where he kept his sturdy little skiff. Each view was intimately familiar, etched into his memory with the precision of one of his own charts. Yet each morning it seemed to offer a fresh perspective, a subtle new revelation of light and shadow, of texture and hue. Today, that freshness felt particularly acute, his eyes cleared by sleep, his spirit attuned by peace, allowing him to see not just the physical landscape, but the underlying divine artistry that had brought it into being. He then turned his attention inward, not to any lingering disquiet about his future, for that had been largely calmed by the night's profound assurances, but to a quiet, focused act of thanksgiving. He didn't kneel or adopt any formal posture of prayer. His communion with God was a constant, ongoing dialogue, a way of being more than a specific act. But in these first moments of conscious engagement with his workspace, he always offered a silent acknowledgement to the giver of all skill, all knowledge, all inspiration. He gave thanks for the clarity of mind that allowed him to perform his exacting work, for the steadiness of hand that guided his pen, for the patience that enabled him to persevere through long hours of meticulous labor, and for the enduring sense of purpose that had animated his life for so many years. This was not a prayer for success or for recognition, but a simple, humble offering of gratitude for the gifts he had been given, and the opportunity to use them in a way that he hoped brought some measure of order, safety, and understanding to the world. The peace that filled him was not just a passive state of being, it was an active wellspring of thankfulness. Only then did he proceed with the more mundane yet still important tasks of his morning routine. He rekindled the embers in the small iron stove in his study, a different hearth from the one in his cottage below, this one used primarily for heating water for his tea, and for keeping the chill from his fingers during long hours of drafting in the colder months. He made a pot of strong black tea, its robust aroma a familiar and welcome counterpoint to the more delicate scents of his cartographic materials. As the tea steeped, he performed his morning ablutions, the cold sea air invigorating his skin, the simple act of washing feeling like a symbolic cleansing, a preparation for the day's focused work. He dressed in his usual attire, sturdy woolen trousers, a thick flannel shirt, and a well-worn leather jerkin, clothes designed for warmth and practicality in his often drafty tower, garments that felt like a second skin, comfortable and familiar. Each action was performed with a mindful, unhurried deliberateness, a continuation of the peaceful rhythm established by his night of profound restorative rest. He drank his tea standing at the eastern window, watching the gulls wheel and cry over the sun-dazzled water, their wild, free movements a stark contrast to the meticulous, constrained precision of his own work. Yet, he felt no envy, only a quiet appreciation for the diversity of God's creation, for the different ways in which life expressed itself. He thought of the immense, unseen forces that governed the ocean before him, the gravitational pull of the moon driving the tides, the intricate patterns of currents shaped by distant winds and the Earth's rotation, the complex ecosystems thriving in its unseen depths. His charts, he knew, could only ever capture the merest surface of this profound, dynamic reality. Yet, even that surface, when rendered with care and accuracy, could provide a vital human connection, a pathway to understanding, a means of safe passage. And in that, there was a deep and abiding satisfaction. The peace he felt this morning allowed him to see his work not as an arrogant attempt to master nature, but as a humble act of listening to it, of attempting to discern and record its truths for the benefit of others. His breakfast was simple: a piece of hardtack, softened slightly in his tea, and a small wedge of sharp, aged cheese. He ate with the same mindful appreciation he had brought to all his morning routines, savoring the contrasting textures and flavors, feeling the nourishment spread through his body. There was no desire for more elaborate fare. His needs were simple, and his contentment was profound. The deep spiritual nourishment he had received during the night seemed to sustain him in a way that mere physical food never could. He was eating to live, to fuel his body for the work he loved, but his truest sustenance came from a different, more mystical source. And this morning, he felt particularly well fed, both in body and in spirit. He thought again of the unmapped territory, of his own future, the great chart of the treacherous shoals, the culmination of so many years of research and labor, would likely be completed within the next few weeks. And then? The question still hovered, but it no longer carried the same edge of anxiety it had possessed the previous evening. The night's profound peace, the deep sense of being held and guided by a loving, sovereign God, had subtly reframed the question. It was no longer, "What will I do?" but rather, "What will God lead me to?" The shift was subtle, yet profound. It moved the locus of control from his own limited understanding and finite capacities to God's infinite wisdom and boundless resources. It transformed the future from a source of potential anxiety into a realm of trusting anticipation, of open-hearted expectancy. He did not know what new lands, what new coastlines, what new internal or external voyages lay ahead, but he knew, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that he would not be navigating them alone. The divine cartographer, the great navigator, who had guided him thus far, would surely continue to direct his paths. With this quiet assurance settling even more deeply into his heart, Jonah finally turned towards his drafting table. He carefully removed the linen cloth from the vellum sheet, revealing the intricate, beautiful, and almost completed chart of the treacherous shoals. The precise black lines delineating coastlines and depths, the delicate blue washes indicating channels and currents, the carefully lettered names of rocks and reefs, All spoke of hours, days, years of patient, meticulous effort. He picked up his finest pen, dipped it in the India ink, and with a hand that was steady, a mind that was clear, and a heart that was profoundly at peace, he prepared to add the day's first, precise, and prayerful line. The keeper of the sea watch, having been kept through the night by the keeper of all, was ready to resume his sacred, joyful work, his every stroke guided by an inner light that was as constant and as true as the North Star itself. The hours of the morning unfolded with a serene, focused industry in Jonah Alistair Finch's tower study. The only sounds were the rhythmic scratch of his pen on the vellum, a sound as delicate and precise as the intricate lines it produced, the occasional soft sigh of the sea breeze as it found its way through the crevices of the ancient stone walls, the distant mournful cry of a circling gull, and the steady, almost imperceptible beat of Jonah's own heart, a rhythm now perfectly attuned to the deep, abiding peace that had become the very atmosphere of his being. He worked with a concentration that was absolute yet entirely unstrained, his mind clear and sharp, his hand steady and sure. The profound restorative sleep of the previous night had not just banished weariness, it had imbued him with a heightened sense of clarity, a sharpened perception, and a quiet, joyful energy that made his meticulous labor feel less like a task, and more like a form of contemplative prayer, a sacred offering. He was currently engaged in the delicate work of adding the final soundings and notations to a particularly complex section of the treacherous shoals, a labyrinth of submerged rocks and unpredictable currents that had claimed many an unwary vessel over the centuries. His information came from a variety of sources: ancient mariners' logs, meticulously cross-referenced, recent hydrographic surveys forwarded to him by the Admiralty, and his own careful observations made over many years from his tower using powerful spyglasses to study the wave patterns and water discolorations that hinted at the hidden dangers below. Each piece of data had to be weighed, verified, and then translated with painstaking accuracy onto the vellum, every line, every symbol, potentially holding the key to a ship's safe passage or its tragic demise. It was work that demanded not only skill and knowledge, but also an immense sense of responsibility, a profound respect for the unforgiving power of the sea. Today, however, that responsibility felt not like a heavy burden, but like a sacred trust, one he was privileged to undertake from a place of deep inner calm and unwavering focus. The peace that had permeated his being since his awakening was not a dreamy, disengaged state that made him oblivious to the precision required by his task. On the contrary, it seemed to enhance his abilities, to quiet the usual mental chatter that can distract and lead to error, allowing him to access a deeper level of intuitive understanding, a more profound connection to the subject of his work. He felt less like he was imposing lines on a blank surface, and more like he was revealing a truth that was already there, patiently uncovering the hidden calligraphy of the ocean floor. There were moments when his hand seemed to move with a wisdom of its own, his pen flowing with an effortless grace, as if guided by an unseen intelligence, translating complex data into elegant, easily comprehensible cartographic language. In these moments, he felt a profound sense of partnership, not just with the generations of mariners and cartographers who had gone before him, but with the very spirit of creation, the divine mind that had first conceived these intricate, dangerous, and beautiful forms. He paused occasionally in his work, not from fatigue, but to simply rest his eyes, to gaze out of the eastern window at the vast, sunlit expanse of the ocean. The sea today was a brilliant sapphire blue, its surface alive with the energetic dance of whitecaps under a brisk northeasterly breeze. Far out on the horizon, the sails of a merchant brigantine, tiny as a child's toy from this distance, could just be discerned, making its careful way southwards. Jonah watched it for a moment, a silent prayer for its safe voyage forming in his heart. He knew the captain of that vessel would likely consult charts, perhaps even one of his own earlier editions, to navigate these waters. And the thought that his own patient, meticulous labors, performed in the solitude of this tower, could contribute to the safety and well-being of unseen, unknown others, filled him with a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction, a humble joy that transcended any desire for personal recognition or reward. This was service, in its purest, most unobtrusive form. He thought of the scriptures that speak of God's word as a lamp to the feet and a light to the path. His own charts, he hoped, served a similar though far humbler purpose for those who navigated the physical seas. They were attempts to illuminate the hidden dangers, to mark the safe channels, to provide a reliable guide through waters that could often be dark, confusing, and perilous. And just as he relied on the divine light of Scripture and the inner leading of the Spirit to navigate the often uncharted territories of his own soul, so he offered his own painstakingly crafted lights to help others on their earthly voyages. The peace he felt within, he realized, was not just for his own comfort. It was meant to overflow, to subtly infuse his work, perhaps even to be transmitted, in some intangible way, through the very lines and symbols he inscribed on the vellum, carrying a silent message of care, of diligence, of a hope for safe passage. He remembered the meticulous, almost ritualistic care with which the ancient scribes had copied the sacred texts, their profound reverence for every letter, every word, knowing they were handling something holy, something life-giving. Jonah felt a similar reverence for his own work today. Each sounding, each symbol for a submerged rock or a tidal rip was not just a piece of data. It was a critical piece of information that could make the difference between life and death. And so he worked with a prayerful attention, a focused devotion, his every stroke an act of careful stewardship. The deep restorative rest of the night had equipped him not just with physical energy and mental clarity, but with a renewed spiritual sensitivity, an enhanced awareness of the sacred dimension of his seemingly secular craft. The hours passed, marked only by the slow transit of the sun across the sky, its light shifting through the various windows of his circular study, creating a moving tapestry of illumination and shadow. He took a brief midday break, eating his simple meal of bread, cheese, and a crisp apple at his drafting table, his eyes still scanning the chart, mentally reviewing the work done, contemplating the sections yet to be completed. There was no sense of pressure, no feeling of being driven by an unrelenting deadline. He worked at his own pace, a pace dictated by the demands of accuracy and the rhythms of his own creative process, a pace that was both productive and deeply peaceful. The unhurried, unanxious quality of his labor was a direct reflection of the unhurried, unanxious state of his soul, a soul that had been truly, profoundly set at ease by its encounter with divine rest. He thought of the immense, hidden landscapes that lay beneath the surface of the ocean, vast mountain ranges, deep, abyssal plains, intricate networks of canyons and valleys, all teeming with unseen life, all part of God's magnificent, mysterious creation. His charts could only hint at these submerged worlds, could only delineate the navigational hazards and the safe passages. Yet, even in this limited two-dimensional representation, there was a sense of wonder, of awe at the complexity and the beauty of what lay hidden. And he felt that his own inner life, too, had its hidden depths, its unmapped territories, its own mysterious currents and submerged landscapes. And just as he sought to understand and chart the external world with as much honesty and accuracy as he could muster, so he also sought, with God's help, to understand and navigate his own inner world, with wisdom, with courage, and with an ever-deepening trust in the divine guide who knew every contour, every hidden reef, every safe harbor of the human soul. As the afternoon sun began its slow descent towards the western horizon, casting long golden shafts of light into his study, Jonah felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. A significant portion of the remaining work on the treacherous shoals chart had been accomplished, each line drawn with precision, each notation verified with care. He had worked steadily without interruption, his concentration unwavering, his spirit calm and centered. He felt a healthy, physical tiredness beginning to settle in his shoulders and back, the pleasant fatigue that comes from focused, meaningful endeavor. But his mind remained clear, his spirit light. The profound peace of the previous night, the quiet joy of his morning awakening, had sustained him through the long hours of exacting labor, proving itself to be not a fleeting mood, but a resilient, life-giving force. The Sea-Watch Tower, his solitary sanctuary of work and contemplation, felt filled not just with the scent of ink and parchment, but with an almost palpable atmosphere of serene, purposeful creativity, a direct outflow of its keeper's own divinely restored and deeply peaceful heart. The sun, now well into its westward arc, sent longer, more oblique rays of golden light slanting through the tall, narrow windows of Jonah's tower study, illuminating the myriad dust motes dancing in the still air, transforming them into a cascade of tiny, ephemeral diamonds. The intricate chart of the treacherous shoals, spread out on the great oak drafting table, seemed to glow with a soft internal luminescence in this mellow afternoon light, its precise lines and delicate washes of color a testament to the long hours of patient, prayerful labor that had been poured into its creation. Jonah Alistair Finch, having worked with unwavering focus and serene diligence throughout the day, now laid down his finest mapping pen, its task for the moment complete. He stretched, feeling the pleasant release of tension in his shoulders and back, a healthy physical weariness that was entirely different from the soul-deep exhaustion that can follow a day lived under the shadow of anxiety or internal unrest. The profound peace that had been his constant companion since his awakening, a direct and blessed fruit of the previous night's divinely gifted sleep, remained an unshakable, luminous presence within him, a calm, clear pool reflecting the quiet satisfaction of a day spent in purposeful, grace-filled endeavor. He rose from his tall stool and walked to the western window, the one that looked out over the rugged, heather-strewn descent towards the sea, and beyond that, to the vast, seemingly limitless expanse of the northern ocean, now taking on the softer, more muted hues of late afternoon. The brisk morning breeze had gentled, and the sea's surface, though still alive with a gentle swell, was less agitated, its earlier energetic sparkle replaced by a more contemplative, silvery sheen. He watched as a small flock of gannets, their white plumage stark against the darkening blue of the water, executed their breathtaking arrow-like dives in pursuit of fish. Their wild, untamed grace, a perfect expression of life, lived in harmony with the elemental forces of nature. There was a profound rightness to the scene, a sense of ancient, divinely ordained rhythms, and Jonah's own spirit, rested and at peace, felt itself to be in quiet accord with that larger, encompassing harmony. He thought of the long journey that this particular chart represented, not just the years of research and drawing, but the culmination of a lifetime's dedication to his craft, to the art and science of cartography. It was, in many ways, his magnum opus, the most complex, most challenging, and perhaps most important work he had ever undertaken. And as its completion drew near, the feelings it evoked were a complex blend, a deep sense of accomplishment, yes, but also a touch of melancholy at the thought of this long companionship coming to an end. And still, that quiet underlying question about what new shores, what new horizons, lay beyond this significant landmark in his life's voyage. But today, unlike the previous evening, that question was not accompanied by a shadow of unease or a tremor of anxiety. The profound peace that had been so deeply instilled in him during his night of restorative rest had subtly reframed his perspective, replacing uncertainty with a quiet, trusting anticipation, a peaceful openness to the unfolding will of the divine navigator. He did not need to see the entire map of his future. It was enough to know that the chartmaker himself held the master plan and would reveal the next leg of the journey in his own perfect time. He considered the biblical story of Solomon after he had completed the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, a task that had consumed vast resources and many years of meticulous labor. There must have been an immense sense of fulfillment, but also perhaps a question of what now, after such a monumental undertaking. And Scripture records that God appeared to Solomon, affirming his work, but also reminding him of the ongoing necessity of faithfulness, of walking in God's ways. Jonah felt a resonance with that. His temple was not of stone and gold, but of vellum and ink, a repository of knowledge, a guide for seafarers. And as its completion neared, he felt a deep sense of the importance of continued faithfulness, not just in the meticulous finishing of this last great work, but in the way he lived out whatever days and tasks remained for him, trusting that even in the quieter, perhaps less overtly productive seasons of life, there was still a sacred purpose, a call to reflect God's light and love in the world. The peace he felt today was not a signal to cease from all effort, but rather an empowerment to continue in a new way, from a place of deeper trust and more serene reliance on divine guidance. The rhythmic, distant flash of the Porthcarrick lighthouse, though not yet visible in the full light of the late afternoon, was nonetheless a constant subliminal presence in his awareness, a reminder of the unwavering vigilance required to keep the lights burning, to ensure safe passage for those at sea. He felt a deep kinship with the unknown keepers of that light, and with all who dedicated their lives to tasks that required steadfastness, precision, and a quiet, often unsung devotion to the well-being of others. His own work, performed in the solitude of his tower, often felt unseen, yet he knew its value, its potential to save lives, to facilitate commerce, to connect distant parts of the world. And this sense of contributing, however humbly, to the larger human enterprise was a source of profound, quiet satisfaction, a satisfaction made all the sweeter by the deep inner peace that now formed the bedrock of his being. He turned from the window and began the simple, methodical tasks of preparing his study for the night. He carefully cleaned his pens again, ensuring no residue of ink remained to dry and clog their delicate nibs. He neatly rolled and secured some of the ancillary charts and research notes he had been consulting, placing them back in their designated drawers or shelves. He covered the great chart on his drafting table with its soft linen cloth, a gesture that felt almost like tucking a beloved child into bed for the night. Each action was performed with a mindful, unhurried grace, a quiet sense of order that mirrored the deep, internal order that had been restored to his soul. There was no frantic tidying, no anxious preparation for the morrow, only a peaceful, respectful bringing of the day's work to a satisfactory close. He thought of the scriptural injunction to be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. He had, in his own quiet way, been living out that verse throughout this day. The anxieties that had briefly touched him the previous evening had been brought before God, not in elaborate, formal petitions, but in the simple, trusting prayer of a yielded heart, and the promised peace, that extraordinary, almost inexplicable serenity that transcends mere human comprehension, had indeed been his constant guardian, keeping his heart untroubled, his mind clear and focused. It was a peace that was not the absence of potential problems, but the overwhelming presence of an all-sufficient God. As the light outside began to soften further, the shadows in his study deepening, Jonah felt the first gentle intimations of his own body's readiness for a different kind of rest, not the brief respite of a midday meal, but the deeper, more complete surrender of the approaching night. A pleasant, wholesome weariness was settling into his limbs, a weariness born of focused, meaningful effort, entirely distinct from the draining exhaustion that can accompany stress or inner turmoil. His mind, though still clear, was beginning to quiet its analytical processes, its creative energies temporarily subsiding, ready to yield to the restorative stillness of sleep. He felt a profound sense of completion, not just of the day's work, but of the day's journey. A journey that had begun in the luminous peace of his awakening and had been sustained by that same serene current throughout its course. He knew that the unmapped territory of his future still lay before him, beyond the completion of this great chart. But the prospect no longer evoked even a shadow of apprehension. Instead, there was a quiet curiosity, a peaceful openness, a deep-seated trust that the same divine navigator who had guided him through the meticulous creation of countless earthly maps would also provide the celestial charts, the inner compass, the guiding stars, for whatever voyages still lay ahead in the unfolding map of his own life. The journey into the night, and into the rest it would bring, felt not like an ending, but like a necessary and welcome preparation for those future, as yet unknown, adventures of the soul. The Sea-Watch Tower, his lifelong sanctuary, felt profoundly peaceful, its ancient stones seeming to resonate with the deep, abiding calm that filled the heart of its faithful, and now blessedly rested, keeper. The sun, now a magnificent fiery ember resting on the very lip of the vast, darkening ocean, cast its final dramatic rays of coppery gold and deepest crimson across the western sky, a breathtaking spectacle of celestial artistry that Jonah, Alistair Finch, watched from the narrow stone balcony encircling his lantern room. He had ascended to this highest point of the Sea-Watch Tower not for any practical duty, as the great lamp itself was automated and would ignite at the precise moment of astronomical twilight, but simply to witness this daily, sacred transition, this glorious, silent farewell between the day and the approaching night. The sea below, a vast, restless canvas, reflected the sky's incandescent hues, its surface shimmering with 1,000 fleeting, fiery ripples. A cool, damp evening breeze, carrying the fresh, sharp scent of salt, and the distant, mournful cry of a homeward-bound curlew, tugged gently at his weathered coat and stirred his silvered hair. He leaned against the sturdy, age-pitted stone parapet, his hands resting on its cool solidity, his spirit quiet, receptive, and profoundly at peace. The deep, unwavering calm that had been his steadfast companion since the previous nights, restorative sleep, a peace born of divine grace and surrendered trust, remained an unshakable anchor within him, allowing him to absorb the almost overwhelming beauty of this moment, not with a sense of poignant transience, but with a deep, appreciative awe, a silent acknowledgement of the infinite, creative power of the God who nightly painted such masterpieces across the heavens, and who also, with equal tenderness, held his own small life, his solitary watch, his unfolding future, in an everlasting, loving embrace. He thought of the countless sunsets he had observed from this very spot, each one a unique, unrepeatable marvel, each a fresh and eloquent sermon on the themes of beauty, impermanence, and the steadfast faithfulness of God, who ordained both the glorious reign of the sun and the equally sacred restorative mystery of the night. There had been evenings when the sky was a canvas of violent, stormy splendor, the sun sinking into a cauldron of bruised purples and angry reds, presaging a night of elemental fury. There had been others when a soft, pearlescent mist had veiled. The horizon and the sun had dissolved into an ethereal, diffused glow, blurring all distinctions, creating a world of soft, dreamlike ambiguity. And then there were evenings like this one, clear, calm, and almost heart-achingly beautiful, where the purity of the colors, the serenity of the scene, spoke directly to the deepest, most contemplative chambers of his soul, evoking a sense of profound gratitude and a quiet, joyful reverence. Each sunset, in its own unique voice, reminded him of the cyclical nature of all things, of the constant, divinely ordained rhythm of activity and rest, of revelation and hiddenness, of outgoing and returning, a rhythm that was mirrored in his own life, in his own spirit. As the very last scintilla of the sun's rim vanished below the sharp dark line of the watery horizon, the great lamp housed just a few feet above his head, its mechanisms as precise and as dependable as the celestial clockwork itself, sprang silently, powerfully to life. Its brilliant electric heart ignited, and the complex array of precisely ground Fresnel lenses instantly began their work, gathering, concentrating, and projecting that intense light outwards in its strong, unwavering, and life-saving beam. The transition was instantaneous, a seamless handover from the fading natural light of day to the steadfast man-harnessed light of the night. Jonah watched, as he always did, as the first powerful sweep of that beam cut a sharp, luminous swathe through the rapidly deepening twilight. A resolute, unwavering finger of hope and guidance, tracing its familiar, reassuring arc across the darkening surface of the ocean. "The light shines in the darkness," he murmured softly to the wind, the ancient familiar words from the prologue to John's Gospel taking on, as they always did in this moment, a fresh, potent, and deeply personal immediacy, and the darkness has not overcome it. His own life's work, he felt with a humble sense of privilege, was to be a faithful, diligent steward of this small, physical, coastal echo of that great, eternal spiritual truth. He remained on the narrow, wind-swept balcony for some time longer, watching as the first hesitant stars began to prick the deep velvety fabric of the eastern sky, their light faint and shy at first, then growing steadily bolder, more confident, as the last vestiges of daylight finally surrendered to the full sovereignty of the night. The sheer, breathtaking immensity of the cosmos, displayed in such unobscured, silent, and majestic clarity from his isolated, lofty vantage point, never failed to fill him with a sense of profound, almost overwhelming humility, awe, and wonder. "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place," the psalmist had sung. "What is mankind that you are mindful of them, human beings that you care for them?" Yet all of Scripture, and indeed Jonah's own deep, lifelong personal experience of God's subtle but undeniable guidance and unfailing provision, affirmed with unshakable certainty that this same divine architect, this incomprehensible intelligence who had effortlessly orchestrated the silent, majestic dance of unnumbered galaxies, was also intimately, tenderly, and constantly mindful of him. Jonah Alistair Finch, a solitary cartographer in his remote stone tower, and of every other human soul journeying through the often confusing landscapes of earthly existence. This profound, almost unbelievable paradox, the simultaneity of God's infinite, transcendent majesty and his intensely personal, immanent, and compassionate care, was the very wellspring of Jonah's enduring faith, the unshakable bedrock of his extraordinary, resilient peace. With a final, long look at the star-dusted heavens and the now invisible but ever-present ocean stretching out into the illimitable darkness, he turned and descended the narrow, steep spiral staircase from the lantern room back into the comparative warmth and enclosed quietude of his study. He felt the familiar, subtle but distinct shift in the tower's atmosphere as night fully established its reign over the world outside. The sounds changed, subtly but perceptibly. The cries of the diurnal seabirds were now entirely silenced, replaced by the occasional distant, mournful call of a nocturnal petrel, or the soft, almost inaudible rustle of unseen, small creatures foraging in the sparse, hardy vegetation that clung to the cliff face at the base of the tower. The vast Atlantic Ocean itself seemed to deepen its voice, its rhythmic sighs against the unyielding granite, taking on a more profound, more resonant, more ancient timbre, a sound that spoke of eternity, of hidden depths, of immeasurable power held in perfect, divine restraint. These were the familiar, comforting sounds of his nightly companionship, and tonight they held no trace of loneliness, no hint of menace, only a profound sense of familiar, shared solitude, a deep, unspoken understanding with the elements and with the Creator who had fashioned them all. He lit a single beeswax candle in his study, its soft, gentle, flickering flame a more congenial companion in these quiet hours than the harsher, more utilitarian glare of the electric lamp he used for his detailed cartographic work. Its mellow, honey-scented glow cast warm, inviting, dancing shadows on the age-darkened wooden bookcases and the rolls of ancient charts, creating an atmosphere of profound, rustic peace, a sanctuary of quiet contemplation. He did not immediately turn to any task, nor did he feel the need for any particular distraction. He simply sat for a while in his old, deeply cushioned leather armchair, allowing the events of the day, the thoughts and feelings that had surfaced, to settle gently within him, like fine sediment slowly clarifying a pool of water. The day's work had been good, productive, accomplished with a calm focus and a quiet joy that had been a direct outflow of his rested spirit. The subtle questions about his unmapped future, which had briefly caused a ripple of disquiet the previous evening, now lay peacefully at anchor in the calm harbor of his trusting surrender to divine guidance. He felt a deep, pervasive contentment, a sense that all was truly, fundamentally well, not because his life was devoid of potential challenges or unanswered questions, but because he knew himself to be securely, lovingly, and eternally held in hands far greater, far wiser, and far more capable than his own. This was the essence of the peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that was not contingent on circumstances, but rooted in relationship, in a profound, unwavering trust, in the goodness and sovereignty of God. He thought, with a quiet, professional empathy, of the mariners who would be out on the dark ocean tonight, perhaps anxiously scanning the horizon for the familiar, reassuring flash of his light, or the light from Porth Carrick. He imagined their relief, their renewed sense of orientation and security, upon sighting that distant, guiding beam. His work, performed in such deliberate, often solitary seclusion, had a very real, very tangible purpose, a direct and often life-saving impact on the safety and well-being of countless unseen, unknown others. This knowledge, this awareness of being a small but vital link in a chain of human interdependence and care, brought him a quiet, profound sense of fulfillment, a humble joy that far outweighed any desire for public recognition or worldly reward. He was not just a maker of maps, a keeper of a light. He was, in his own unassuming way, a guardian of safe passage, a facilitator of connection, a small instrument of a larger benevolent providence. And this deep sense of purpose, too, contributed significantly to the unshakable serenity that now formed the very bedrock of his being. He reached for the ancient leather-bound psalter that lay on the small table beside his chair, its pages worn smooth and soft by the hands of generations. He didn't open it with the intention of rigorous study or theological dissection, but simply for the companionship of its timeless words, for the deep, resonant comfort of its familiar cadences, for the way it so perfectly articulated the most profound yearnings, sorrows, joys, and praises of the human heart in its long, often arduous, pilgrimage towards God. His fingers, guided more by memory and feel than by conscious sight in the dim candlelight, found their way to one of his most beloved passages, Psalm 139. "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast." He read the words slowly, almost mouthing them, allowing their ancient, powerful truth to seep into the deepest recesses of his spirit. Presence, guidance, being held fast. These were not abstract theological concepts. They were the lived, experiential realities of his existence, confirmed once more by the profound peace that had been his gift through the night and his companion through this day. In such an assurance, what room was there for fear, for anxiety, for the restless striving that so often robs the soul of its true, God-given rest? As the evening wore on, and the fire in the hearth burned down to a bed of softly glowing embers, the initial pleasant weariness from the day's activities began to deepen, transforming into a gentle, insistent, and entirely welcome call to a more complete and profound rest. His eyelids grew perceptibly heavier, his thoughts more diffuse, more dreamlike, meandering like a slow, peaceful river towards the great, silent ocean of sleep. He was not fighting this natural inclination, not attempting to prolong his wakefulness with forced activity or anxious rumination. He welcomed the body's innate signals, recognizing them as an integral part of the divinely ordained, life-sustaining rhythm of effort and release, of engagement and surrender. He knew, with a quiet, joyful certainty, that another period of profound, deeply restorative sleep awaited him, another opportunity to be refilled at the eternal wellspring, to be renewed in the hidden sanctuary of divine peace, to be prepared once more for whatever the next day, the next watch, the next uncharted leg of his life's voyage might bring. The great lamp entrusted to his care would continue its unwavering, silent vigil through the darkest hours, and soon, Jonah Alastair Finch, its faithful, humble human keeper, would entrust himself, his work, his future, his very being, once more to the ultimate eternal keeper, the inexhaustible source of all light, all guidance, and all perfect, life-giving peace, ready and serenely eager to receive the blessed, sacred gift of untroubled, restorative slumber. The vast northern ocean whispered its ancient, timeless lullaby against the steadfast cliffs, and the cartographer of the seas, his own inner compass now perfectly aligned with the true north of God's love, was preparing to set sail on the peaceful, starlit waters of divine rest. The soft, flickering light of the single beeswax candle in Jonah's study cast elongated, dancing shadows that seemed to gently sway in rhythm with the distant, hypnotic sigh of the ocean, creating an atmosphere of profound tranquility, a sanctuary, perfectly attuned for the approaching surrender of sleep. The weariness that had settled into his limbs from the day's focused endeavors was now a pleasant, undeniable heaviness, a physical confirmation that his body had given its all, and was now rightfully, gratefully anticipating the deep restoration that only true, untroubled rest could provide. The earlier intellectual vibrancy, the keen edge of his cartographer's mind, had softened, giving way to a more diffuse, dreamlike state of awareness, a gentle disengagement from the world of lines, measurements, and logical deductions. The profound peace that had been his steadfast anchor throughout the day, a peace born from the sacred stillness of the previous night, remained an unwavering, luminous presence within him, not a fragile mood easily dispelled, but a deep, intrinsic quality of his spirit, a serene foundation upon which the edifice of his nightly rest would now be securely built. The great oak drafting table, with its nearly completed masterwork, covered by the soft linen cloth, stood as a silent, patient sentinel, its demanding voice now hushed, its intricate details temporarily veiled, awaiting the renewed energy and clarity that the coming night's repose would surely bring to its creator. Jonah Alastair Finch sat for a final few moments in his ancient leather armchair, the venerable, heavy psalter resting closed upon his knees, its physical weight a comforting, grounding presence. His gaze, no longer focused on any particular object in the room, seemed to be directed inwards, or perhaps outwards, towards an unseen, eternal horizon. He was not engaged in active, formulated thought, not dissecting theological concepts or replaying the day's minor events. His mind, like a vast, calm sea at twilight after the winds have entirely ceased, was still, profoundly reflective, mirroring the immense, starlit serenity of the heavens that arched over his solitary sea-watch tower. The subtle, almost imperceptible questions about the unmapped territories of his future, The quiet wonderings about the purpose and shape of his remaining years, which had briefly touched his spirit the evening before, now lay dormant, not suppressed or ignored, but gently cradled in a much larger encompassing sense of trust, a peaceful assurance that the divine cartographer who had charted the courses of galaxies and the migrations of the smallest birds also held the blueprint of his own life and would reveal its next leg with perfect wisdom and in perfect time. This was not resignation, but a profound, liberating release, a joyful surrender to a guidance infinitely more reliable than his own. He thought, with a quiet sense of awe, of the biblical concept of abiding in Christ as a branch abides in the vine, drawing its life, its sustenance, its fruitfulness from that inseparable connection. He felt that the peace he had experienced so profoundly, so consistently throughout this day, was a direct consequence of that spiritual abiding, a state achieved not through striving or intense effort, but through a simple, moment-by-moment, choice to remain connected to the source, to consciously dwell in the presence of God, even amidst the meticulous demands of his craft. And sleep, he was coming to understand with ever-deepening clarity, was perhaps the ultimate expression of that abiding, a time when all self-generated activity ceased, when the individual will was entirely surrendered, allowing the divine life sap of grace, peace, and renewal to flow unobstructed into the deepest, most receptive parts of the soul. It was a nightly returning to the vine, a sacred reconnection that ensured continued spiritual vitality and fruitfulness. His body's natural, God-given rhythms were now sending clear, unmistakable signals of its readiness for profound rest. A slow, deep yawn, unresisted and entirely natural, stretched his jaw. His eyelids, heavy as ancient velvet curtains, drooped with increasing insistence. The myriad sounds of the night, the distant rhythmic cadence of the surf against the cliffs, a sound now so deeply familiar it was almost part of his own being. The soft, almost inaudible whisper of the night wind as it explored the ancient crevices of the tower's stone. The occasional, high, lonely cry of a nocturnal seabird far out over the dark water. These sounds were no longer perceived as distinct, separate entities, but were merging, blending into a single, soothing, undifferentiated symphony of profound, elemental quietude, a perfect, natural lullaby designed by the Creator himself to draw his weary creatures into the restorative embrace of sleep. These were the familiar, cherished sounds of his chosen solitude, and tonight they were imbued with an extraordinary sense of peace, not of isolation or loneliness, but of deep, sacred companionship with the silent, watchful presence of God and the vast, breathing life of his creation. With a movement that was slow, deliberate, and imbued with a quiet reverence, Jonah rose from his armchair. The ancient floorboards of the study, worn smooth by the passage of his own feet and those of generations of imagined predecessors in this solitary watch, barely creaked beneath his light tread. He carefully placed the psalter back on its accustomed shelf, its wisdom absorbed, its comfort received. He then performed his final, simple rituals before retiring to his sleeping chamber below. He ensured the beeswax candle was safely extinguished, plunging the study into a deeper, more uniform darkness, relieved only by the faint, diffuse starlight filtering through the windows and the rhythmic, distant flash of the Porth-Carrick beam. He checked the latch on the heavy oaken door that led to the outer balcony, securing it fast against the possibility of a sudden squall, though the night air remained remarkably calm and still. Each small, habitual action was performed with a mindful, prayerful deliberateness, a quiet, respectful bringing of order and closure to his small, consecrated domain, an outward reflection of the profound inner order that divine grace had so lovingly established within his soul. These were not tasks performed out of lingering anxiety or obsessive compulsion, but out of a deep, peaceful sense of responsible stewardship, of tender, careful love for this place that was both his fortress and his sanctuary. as he prepared to descend the narrow, winding stone staircase to his sleeping quarters. He paused for a moment at the head of the stairs, looking back into the now almost entirely darkened study. This room, the crucible of his life's work, the silent witness to his decades of patient labor, his intellectual struggles, his artistic triumphs, and his quiet, ongoing communion with God, felt profoundly peaceful, as if it too were settling into its own nightly rest, its purpose for the day fulfilled. He felt a surge of deep, quiet affection for this space, for its ancient stones, its accumulated wisdom, its very atmosphere of serene, focused creativity. And he knew, with a certainty that warmed his heart, that the same divine presence that hallowed this room would also accompany him into the deeper stillness of his bedroom, and into the even deeper, more mysterious stillness of sleep itself. He remembered the words of Jesus, spoken to his disciples on the eve of his own greatest trial. "In my Father's house are many rooms. I go to prepare a place for you." While Jonah knew those words had a far greater eschatological significance, he also felt, in a humbler, more immediate sense, that his own small, austere sleeping chamber was a place prepared, a sanctuary, made ready not by his own efforts alone, but by the loving, provident grace of God, a space consecrated for the sacred purpose of rest, renewal, and intimate hidden communion. And he approached it now, not with any lingering trepidation about the unmapped future, not with any residual burden from the day that was past, but with a quiet, grateful, and entirely peaceful anticipation. Lying down in his narrow, familiar bed, the coolness of the old linen sheets a welcome sensation against his skin, the substantial weight of his mother's hand-stitched quilt, a comforting, reassuring embrace. Jonah Alistair Finch closed his eyes. The external world, with all its demands, its complexities, its subtle and not-so-subtle invitations to anxiety, began to recede, to fade into an infinite, peaceful distance. The rhythmic, elemental sounds of the ocean and the wind became a soothing, hypnotic, and all-encompassing cadence, a divine mantra drawing him gently, irresistibly downwards into the welcoming, restorative depths of profound unconsciousness. There was no internal struggle, no final flaring of restless thoughts, to be wrestled into submission. His mind was as calm and as clear as a mountain lake at dawn. His heart was as still and as profoundly at peace as the deepest, most hidden ocean trench. His body was willingly, gratefully surrendering to the overwhelming, delicious invitation of healing, restorative sleep. He was like a small, weary but utterly trusting seabird, folding its wings after a long day's flight, and settling securely into its sheltered, familiar nest, knowing itself to be perfectly safe, perfectly protected. His very last conscious thought, before the gentle, irresistible tide of slumber finally and completely claimed him, was not a specific word, not a formulated prayer, but a profound, all-encompassing feeling, a feeling of being utterly and completely immersed in and enfolded by an ocean of unconditional love, of infinite tenderness, of unshakable peace. He yielded himself to the approaching darkness, not as an enemy to be feared or an emptiness to be endured, but as a sacred, fertile sanctuary, a hallowed space where the deepest, most miraculous work of divine restoration and renewal could occur, undisturbed and unopposed. The great Porthcarrock lighthouse continued its unwavering, rhythmic, and silent sweep across the vast, dark sea, a faithful, inanimate sentinel keeping its lonely watch over the sleeping world. And Jonah Alistair Finch, its humble human counterpart, the meticulous keeper of the sea watch, secure in the unshakable knowledge that the ultimate, eternal keeper of all souls neither slumbers nor sleeps, drifted effortlessly, peacefully, gratefully, into the profound, boundless, and exquisitely healing embrace of God-given, divinely blessed rest. The ancient charts of the heavens wheeled silently above, the timeless ocean whispered its eternal secrets to the shore, and all was deeply, wonderfully, serenely, and perfectly well within the soul of the old cartographer. The profound velvet curtain of the deepest night descended completely upon the sea-watch tower, enfolding Jonah Alistair Finch in an embrace of stillness so absolute, so sacred, it felt like the very essence of eternity, a timeless pause in the restless cadence of the created world. His consciousness, having navigated far beyond the most distant, charted archipelagos of waking thought, was now utterly submerged in the boundless, tranquil ocean of restorative slumber, a realm where the only compass was the unwavering, infinite love of God, the only chart the luminous, unwritten map of divine peace. The physical world, the ancient, wind-polished stones of his solitary tower, the rhythmic, distant sweep of the Porthcarrick beacon, the eternal, elemental dialogue between the ocean and the unyielding cliffs, all had dissolved into an almost unimaginable remoteness, their sensory reality replaced by an inner landscape of ineffable serenity, a sanctuary of the soul where the only presence was the all-encompassing, all-sufficient presence of the divine. His breathing, now as slow, as gentle, and as almost imperceptible as the molecular exchange of dew between the sleeping earth and the silent, watchful heavens, was the quiet, rhythmic tide of this inner ocean, a testament to the profound, life-giving rest that had wholly claimed him, body, mind, and spirit. He was no longer Jonah the cartographer, the scholar of lines and boundaries, the meticulous keeper of nautical lore. He was, in these sacred, hidden hours, simply a beloved soul, at anchor in the infinitely safe, infinitely spacious harbor of God's eternal presence, his vessel of selfhood rocking gently, peacefully in the cradle of an unconditional, everlasting, and perfectly restorative calm. In this hallowed sanctum of deep, dreamless unconsciousness, where the ceaseless, often clamorous loom of the analytical intellect is completely stilled, and the soul's most carefully constructed, fiercely guarded defenses are willingly, trustingly laid down, the most profound, most intimate, and often most transformative ministries of divine grace are performed, unseen and unsung by the waking world. For Jonah, these were not merely hours of blankness, of suspended animation, or of mere biological recuperation. They were a period of sacred, silent, and deeply efficacious spiritual alchemy. It was as if the divine physician, with an infinitely tender, infinitely skillful, and unerringly precise touch, was moving through the most hidden, most vulnerable corridors of his being, gently cleansing any residual subtle toxins of fear, doubt, or unspoken sorrow that might linger from past voyages, patiently, lovingly mending the almost invisible hairline fractures that life's inevitable storms and sorrows invariably inflict upon the delicate fabric of the human spirit, and slowly, meticulously, repolishing the occasionally dimmed, sea-misted facets of his soul, until they reflected with renewed, pristine brilliance the pure, unwavering, and glorious light of their compassionate and omnipotent Maker. This was a profound cellular reattunement to the divine frequency, a deep, resonant reharmonization with the eternal symphony of God's love, all accomplished in a stillness so absolute, a silence so deeply resonant with unspoken truth that it was the very language of God Himself, speaking overwhelming, unconditional peace to the innermost depths of Jonah's surrendered and receptive being. If his dormant mind, in its mysterious nocturnal navigations through the unchartable landscapes of profound slumber, still hosted any fleeting ephemeral forms or ethereal impressions, they were utterly removed from the concrete, definable shapes of his earthly charts, or the sequential cause and effect logic of his conscious, daylight reasoning. Instead, they were far more likely to be pure, unmediated, and ineffable experiences of divine attributes, a profound, overwhelming sensation, perhaps, of being utterly and completely enveloped, dissolved, and reconstituted in an infinite, boundless ocean of warm, compassionate, and living light, a light where all sense of individual limitation, all fear of judgment, all shadow of unworthiness simply vanished without a trace, leaving only a joyful, liberating, and expansive awareness of belonging, of being an integral, cherished, and indispensable part of a vast, benevolent, and perfectly harmonious whole. Or he might experience a timeless, formless, and utterly effortless journey through celestial, unimaginable gardens of unimaginable beauty and serenity, not as a detached observer, but as an intrinsic element of that divine, breathtaking tableau. Every unseen flower, every unheard melody, every unfelt breeze resonating with a silent, perfect, and eternal harmony that was the very essence, the very heartbeat of God's infinite and unconditional peace. These were not mere dreams to be catalogued, analyzed, or interpreted upon waking. They were sacred, transformative immersions, profound, ineffable encounters with the numinous, subtle yet powerful spiritual infusions that were reordering his soul's deepest allegiances, realigning his most fundamental desires with the eternal, loving will of God, steeping his entire being in a love that was far beyond all human telling, a peace that was far beyond all earthly compare, a joy that was unspeakable and full of glory. The ancient, steadfast stones of his sea-watch tower, silent, stoic witnesses to the passage of unnumbered centuries, to countless storms and myriad calms, seemed to exude an aura of enduring strength, of unshakable refuge, of a resilient permanence that resonated deeply with the peace that now filled their sleeping keeper. And Jonah, held securely within their time-worn protective embrace, felt, at an unconscious, cellular level, a profound connection to that enduring, timeless strength. He knew, with a certainty that lay far deeper than any conscious thought or intellectual conviction, that his own true, ultimate foundation was not in his acquired skill as a cartographer, not in his accumulated knowledge of the treacherous seas, not even in the formidable physical security of his ancient stone tower, but in the immutable, eternal, and unshakable rock of ages, the unwavering, omnipotent faithfulness of his loving God. This profound, entirely unarticulated, yet utterly central trust was the very bedrock of his extraordinary peace, the unyielding anchor that allowed his spirit to rest with a complete abandon, a serene completeness that few souls in this restless world ever truly find or experience. The great, silent, wheeling tapestry of the constellations, those celestial charts drawn by the unerring hand of God himself, continued their majestic, timeless, and utterly predictable journey across the infinite black velvet of the night sky, each distant, glittering star a spark of divine, creative light, a silent, irrefutable whisper of eternal order, a promise of guidance in the darkest night. The vast northern ocean, that immense, breathing, and life-filled entity, whispered its ancient, rhythmic, and profound secrets to the unyielding granite feet of the headland beneath his tower. The night wind, having traveled over countless leagues of open water, sang its solitary, ethereal, and strangely comforting plain song around the age-old weathered stones of the sea-watch. And within its deepest, most secluded, most lightless heart, Jonah Alistair Finch, the humble earthly guardian of lines, boundaries, and safe passages, slept on, his own small, precious vessel of life, now navigating with effortless grace the luminous, unchartable, and infinitely welcoming oceans of divine peace, his inner landscape being lovingly redrawn, his soul's deepest coordinates being perfectly, tenderly recalibrated by the unerring wisdom and the infinite compassion of the great navigator, the eternal loving source of all true guidance, all profound rest, all perfect, boundless, and everlasting love. The night reigned in its deepest, most sacred stillness, and the keeper of the sea-watch, himself profoundly, securely, and blessedly kept by the keeper of all creation, was immersed in a peace as fathomless, as life-giving, and as eternal as the very heart of God. As you, dear listener, prepare to navigate your own passage through the quiet waters of the night, may the peace that enveloped Jonah Alistair Finch in his sea-watch tower also find its gentle, sure way into the deepest harbors of your own heart. Remember the steadfastness of the lighthouse, a symbol of God's unwavering presence and His constant guiding light, even when the seas of life feel dark or uncertain. Release now the charts of your own striving, the anxieties of your own making, and entrust your voyage to the divine navigator who knows every current, every shoal, every safe anchorage of your soul. Breathe in His profound calm, exhale all that troubles you, and allow yourself to be carried by the gentle, irresistible tide of His restorative, healing grace. May His peace be your constant companion, His love your unfailing guide, and may you awaken to a new dawn refreshed in body, renewed in spirit, and ready to sail forth in the joyful confidence of His everlasting care.